Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. I'll never forget the night it happened. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect anything strange, just an ordinary apartment complex on the outskirts of town. My roommate, Anna, and I had lived there for about a year, always keeping to ourselves, never believing in anything supernatural. That night, I stayed up late, scrolling through my phone while Anna had already gone to bed. The building was quiet, except for the faint sound of creaking floors as people moved around in neighboring apartments. I didn't think much of it until I heard something coming from inside my closet. At first, I assumed it was just the usual settling of the building, old pipes, settling walls, creaking floorboards. But the sound didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate, like someone shifting inside the closet, dragging something along the floor. I set my phone down and sat up, listening. The sound was coming from the back of the closet, from deep within. My pulse quickened as I imagined what could be inside. I stood up, my feet making soft thuds on the worn carpet, and walked toward the closet. The door creaked open as I pulled it back. I didn't know what I expected, but it wasn't what I saw. Nothing but old clothes and random boxes stacked in the corner. I sighed, relieved but still uneasy, and pulled the closet door shut again. As I turned to head back to bed, something caught my eye. A faint shadow flickering at the edge of the doorframe. I froze, staring at it, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But the shadow lingered, unmoving. I wanted to dismiss it, but something wasn't right. Slowly, I stepped closer, my heart thudding in my chest. I reached out and touched the doorframe, but there was nothing there. Then, from inside the apartment came a whisper. It was faint at first, so soft I almost convinced myself it was in my head. "Let me out." I spun around, my breath catching. The whisper had come from the direction of the closet, but there was no one there. My hands trembled as I forced myself to look back at the closet door. It was still shut, but I could feel the presence of whatever, or whoever, was on the other side. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Let me out." I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My legs moved involuntarily toward the closet. I wasn't in control anymore, as if something had taken over my body. I stood there, staring at the door, trying to process what I was hearing. Then, with a burst of courage I didn't know I had, I threw open the closet door. Nothing, just empty clothes and old boxes. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared into the abyss of the dark closet. But it wasn't empty. I could feel it, like someone, or something, was watching me from within. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. I backed away, unable to take my eyes off the closet. The whisper was still there, though it had softened like it was retreating but not quite gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building, every shuffle of a neighbor in the hall, felt like it was pointing right to me. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to look inside the closet again. I told Anna what happened, but she didn't believe me. Still, that night, and every night after, when I closed my eyes, I could still hear the whisper, "Let me out." It started with a simple drive. I had always been fascinated by old lighthouses, drawn to their solitude and the stories they seemed to hold. So, one weekend, I decided to take a trip to an isolated one perched on a cliff by the sea. It was something I'd always wanted to do, something to escape from the noise of daily life. The lighthouse was miles away from any town or signs of human life. The drive to get there was long, winding through narrow, desolate roads with nothing but trees and rocky cliffs on either side. The closer I got, the more the world seemed to shrink. By the time I arrived, the sun had begun to set, casting a long, eerie glow over the water below. The lighthouse stood tall, its white paint peeling and windows dark. The air smelled of salt and brine, and the only sound was the crashing waves below. I parked my car and began the short hike up the steep path leading to the base of the lighthouse. The only other thing besides the distant roar of the sea was the silence that seemed to engulf everything. When I reached the entrance, I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was musty and cold, with narrow, spiraling stairs leading to the top. Each step groaned beneath my feet as I climbed. It wasn't long before I reached the top, where the view was breathtaking. The sea stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving. I stood there, lost in the beauty of it all, when something made me glance back toward the stairs. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing there, silhouetted against the narrow frame of the doorway. My stomach twisted, and my heart skipped a beat. But when I turned fully around, there was no one there. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks. The wind whistled through the small broken windows, and I shivered, forcing the creeping unease to the back of my mind. As I took in the view again, I thought about the stories of ships lost at sea, the lonely keepers who had watched from these towers for generations. The idea of isolation felt comforting until I realized that I wasn't alone. Not truly. There was something off about the silence, the absence of birds, the usual sounds of life. Everything was too still, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I made my way back down the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath me echoing. When I reached the bottom, the door was shut. How had I not noticed that before? The door hadn't moved on its own. My heart raced again as I reached for the handle, only to find it locked from the inside. I was trapped. Panic hit me hard. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The lighthouse stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but ocean and cliffs. I tried to open the door, banging on it, shouting for help, but there was no one around. The sound of my own voice felt hollow in the empty space. I spent what felt like hours trying to find a way out, but the door refused to budge. It was as if something had sealed it behind me, something I couldn't see or understand. The fear grew, sinking into every part of me. The thought that I might be trapped here, in this ancient lighthouse where the echoes of the past lingered, was too much to bear. When I finally slumped to the floor, exhausted and hopeless, I noticed something strange. The silence seemed to have shifted. Not just quiet, it was as if the world itself had grown quieter. The air was still, heavy, as though time had stopped. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, when I heard it. The faint sound of a distant bell, soft and low. It wasn't coming from inside the lighthouse. It was from the sea. The bell rang again, louder this time. It echoed off the cliffs, and I couldn't tell if it was real or some strange, haunting memory. My stomach turned as I realized there was no ship in sight, no boat or rescue, just the sound of a bell calling from the void. Trembling, I stood up and went to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. Below, far out on the water, I saw a flicker of light, dim, almost ghostly. It moved closer, but the lighthouse had no boats or ships. No life should have been out there. I forced myself to look away, but the bell continued, growing louder and more insistent. I didn't know if it was real, or if my mind was playing tricks, but I knew one thing. The lighthouse wasn't just keeping watch over the sea. It felt like the sea was watching me. I never saw anyone outside, never found a way out. But the bell still echoes in my mind, always just out of reach. I don't know if anyone else heard it, or if I was the only one who ever would. It was a summer afternoon when we decided to take a spontaneous drive out to the old abandoned amusement park. None of us had ever been before, but we'd heard the stories. Rumors of a park that had been shut down decades ago, overgrown with weeds and vines, its colorful rides rusting and decaying. We weren't looking for anything creepy, just a place to explore and take some pictures. The drive there wasn't long, about an hour through winding country roads. The sun was high and the air was thick with the scent of wildflowers. As we pulled up to the entrance, the first thing we noticed was how eerily quiet it was. The gates were rusted shut, but we squeezed through a gap in the fence and stepped onto the cracked asphalt. The place looked like something straight out of a forgotten dream. Look at this. someone said, their voice quiet, almost reverent. We stood in awe at the sight before us, the remains of what must have once been a lively and vibrant amusement park. Faded signs still hung overhead, some barely legible. Ferris wheels, their once bright colors now faded and peeling, stood in silence, looming like ancient sentinels. The tracks of a roller coaster were still visible, but most of the cars had rusted into skeletal remains. The silence was oppressive. There wasn't even the chirping of birds, just the distant hum of wind through empty, hollow spaces. We wandered from ride to ride, snapping photos, laughing, and sharing stories about the park's past. It felt like a trip back in time, though none of us truly believed in the urban legends we had heard. It was just a derelict amusement park, nothing more than an old curiosity. But things started to change. As we approached an old haunted house ride, something felt off. The air felt colder, the light dimmer, though the sun was still high above. We tried to brush it off, thinking maybe our imaginations were just running wild. One of us suggested we split up, explore different areas of the park, and regroup later. I reluctantly agreed. I wandered deeper into the park, feeling increasingly uneasy. The further I went, the quieter things became, until I couldn't even hear the others anymore. My footsteps echoed off the cracked pavement. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, but every creak, every rustle in the bushes made me jump. That's when I saw it, the figure standing at the edge of the roller coaster tracks. It was hard to tell what it was at first, blending into the shadows. A tall, slender figure, maybe a person, maybe not. It didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stared back at it, locked in some kind of strange, silent standoff. Time felt frozen, as if the world had come to a standstill. Then, without warning, the figure turned and walked into the woods. My fear finally snapped, and I sprinted back toward the main part of the park, calling out for my friends. When I got there, they were already gathered, looking at me with worried expressions. I told them what I'd seen, but they didn't believe me at first. We searched the area, but the figure, or whatever it had been, was gone. We all chalked it up to my imagination, or maybe the stress of the place getting to me. But then, later that night, after we'd left the park and were back in the quiet of our homes, something strange happened. In a flash of clarity, I remembered something I hadn't noticed before. The faded sign near the entrance had a small line of text at the bottom, something I hadn't seen earlier. It read, "Those who enter never leave." It was the middle of summer when a group of friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to a nearby lake. None of us had ever been there before, but the promise of clear waters and warm sun was too tempting to pass up. The drive wasn't long, just far enough to feel like we were escaping the noise of the city, but not so far that we'd lose cell service. The day started perfectly. We arrived early, claiming a spot near the shore, and spent the afternoon swimming, laughing, and basking in the sunlight. The lake was calm, almost unnaturally so. The water was glassy and there wasn't a single ripple. It was eerie in its stillness, but we were too preoccupied with the warmth and the relaxation to give it much thought. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the water, we decided to go for one last swim before the evening cooled. The water was still as we dove in, and it felt refreshing. The perfect end to a perfect day. But as I swam further out, the light from the setting sun began to fade, and the water became darker. That's when I noticed something strange beneath me. It wasn't an object or a shadow. It was a presence. Something shifted below the surface, too far down for me to make out. My stomach twisted and I stopped swimming, treading water as my eyes strained into the depths. There was nothing visibly there, but I could feel it. A sensation like being watched, like something was studying me from beneath. "Hey," I called out to my friends, trying to hide the unease in my voice. "Can you guys feel that? Like, something's down there?" They splashed and joked, completely unaware. I didn't tell them how much I wanted to get out of the water. The longer I stayed, the stronger the feeling grew. It was as if the lake itself had become a living, breathing entity, waiting. I swam back to shore, hurried and shaking off the cold, unsure if what I had felt was real. The others were still laughing, throwing a frisbee, soaking up the last of the day's warmth. I tried to forget about the sensation and told myself it was just my nerves playing tricks. As we started packing up to leave, I noticed something odd in the sand near our stuff. Tracks. Not footprints, though. Drag marks, deep and deliberate, leading from the water toward the woods. My heart stopped as I followed them with my eyes. They disappeared into the trees, where there was nothing but silence. I didn't say anything to my friends. I couldn't bring myself to. As we drove away, I kept looking back at the lake, the sun now fully set, casting a dark, brooding reflection. That night, I couldn't sleep. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I kept wondering, what was in that water? And whatever it was it still down there, waiting for us to return? It was a quiet evening, and I decided to take a walk through the old cemetery. The thought of it used to make me uneasy, but over the years, I'd grown used to its stillness. It was nestled at the edge of town, surrounded by trees that loomed over the grave markers like silent sentinels. I used to come here whenever I wanted solitude, away from the noise of daily life. That night, something felt off. Even though I'd walked these grounds countless times, the air felt heavier, thicker. The sky was overcast, casting everything in a dim gray light. I didn't see another soul around, which wasn't unusual. The place had long since fallen into disuse. The graves seemed older than I remembered, some barely legible, the inscriptions worn away by time. As I wandered through the rows, something caught my attention. Faint whispers, too quiet to make out but insistent. I strained my ears, expecting to hear nothing but silence, yet the whispers grew louder. Not words, just hushed murmurs as if someone was close, though I couldn't see anyone. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe the wind was playing tricks on me, but the hairs on my neck stood up. The cemetery had always been quiet, peaceful, but tonight it felt like I wasn't alone. Then I saw him, or rather, it. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, blending with the shadows. A man, or at least I thought it was a man. He stood at the edge of a broken gravestone, motionless, watching me with eyes I couldn't see but felt. My heart pounded. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, I could make out more of its features, or rather, the lack of them. There was no face, just a void where the eyes should have been, empty and black. It wasn't human, not anymore. My breath hitched, and I realized I couldn't look away. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me, growing more insistent. The figure raised its hand, reaching toward me, and I felt something inside me snap. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. The graves blurred past me, the whispering growing louder, more urgent. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel its presence closing in. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods, my legs giving out beneath me. I collapsed against a tree, trembling, waiting for something to happen. But the figure never followed. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to speak. The whispers faded, leaving only the silence. When I finally got to my feet and looked back, the cemetery was empty. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there. I don't know what it was, and I'm not sure I want to know. I haven't returned to the cemetery since. I used to visit my grandfather's house every summer when I was a kid. It was an old farmhouse, isolated, sitting at the edge of a quiet valley. My parents used to leave me there for weeks while they traveled, and I never minded. Grandpa was old and grumpy, but he told the best stories about the woods that surrounded us. The house itself wasn't much, a weathered wooden structure with creaky floorboards and faded wallpaper. Outside, there were fields of tall grass stretching endlessly, and beyond that, the forest. One evening, as I explored the woods near his house, I noticed something strange. There was an old, abandoned barn deeper into the trees, one I had never seen before. It stood isolated from the rest of the woods, its roof sagging and walls covered in ivy. It was out of place, and curiosity got the better of me. I approached the barn, my steps quiet on the grass. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. There was a faint, almost imperceptible noise, like whispers carried by the wind. I stopped, listening. The whispers seemed to be coming from inside the barn, but there was no sign of life around it. I pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the barn was dark, except for slivers of light filtering through the broken roof. Dust hung in the air, thick and heavy. It smelled of decay, wood, rot, and something else I couldn't place. I could barely see, but I moved cautiously, my heartbeat quickening. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the barn, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. A tall, slender shadow that didn't quite belong. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers had grown louder, almost like they were surrounding me now. I strained to see more, but the figure remained in the shadows. Then, slowly, it moved. Not like a human, though. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if whatever this thing was didn't know how to walk properly. It tilted its head, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in its hollow eyes. The whispers intensified, growing louder, more frantic. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, the barn now filled with that oppressive silence, only broken by those relentless whispers. And then, from the shadows, I heard a voice. Help me. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't human either, low and raspy, like it hadn't spoken in centuries. My legs felt like lead, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. The whispers became screams, but they were inside my head. I could feel them, clawing at my mind. The figure stepped closer, its limbs bent awkwardly as if they didn't belong to a living thing, and then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. I collapsed to the floor, unable to move or think. My heart thundered in my chest, and the barn was silent again. I sat there for what felt like hours, unsure if the fear or the silence was worse. When I finally managed to stand, I left the barn and didn't look back. The rest of the summer passed without further incident. My grandfather never mentioned the barn, and I never brought it up. To this day, I don't know what I saw, but I know one thing. It wasn't human, and it wasn't supposed to be there. It was supposed to be a simple evening drive. The kind of drive that takes you out of the city and into the quiet, unfamiliar outskirts where there's nothing but endless fields and trees stretching out to the horizon. I had always enjoyed these drives, away from the noise, away from everything familiar. That night, I decided to take the back roads, hoping to clear my mind after a long day. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in shades of purple and orange. The road stretched before me, winding through rolling hills and fields that seemed to go on forever. For the first hour, everything felt peaceful. The radio played softly, the hum of the car was steady beneath me. But then, something shifted. The air seemed to grow colder, and I noticed that the horizon wasn't as far away as it once had been. The trees grew thicker, their shadows stretching across the road like dark sentinels watching me. I didn't think much of it at first, just the usual unease that comes with driving alone at night. But as I continued down the road, I started to notice strange shapes, figures standing still in the fields. They looked like people, but they didn't move, just standing there, watching. I tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe they were just trees or scarecrows someone had placed out there. But the longer I drove, the more certain I became that they weren't. These shapes were too still, too human. My heart began to race as I passed one of them. It was a figure in the distance, silhouetted against the darkening sky. It was too far away to see any features, but I could feel its gaze as though it were right beside me. Just shadows, I whispered to myself, my hands tightening on the wheel. But then, something changed. One of the figures moved. Just a twitch of its head. Too subtle to be human. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. My eyes were locked on the figure as it took a slow, deliberate step forward. It was closer now, and I could see more clearly. A tall, thin shape, too long in its limbs, too unnatural in its stillness. Panic surged through me. I wanted to turn around, to get out of there, but my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I couldn't tear my eyes away from that figure. It took another step, its motion almost gliding like it wasn't walking but floating. Suddenly, more of them appeared. From the fields, from the woods, figures, countless figures, all standing silently. Their shapes were indistinct, but they all seemed to watch me with those impossible, still, hollow eyes. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. The car felt too small, too confined. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was like they were closing in, stretching out across the empty landscape. Then, without warning, they began to advance. Step by step, they moved in sync, like a silent wave. They didn't run, they didn't scream. They just walked. I couldn't stay there. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but there was no rational explanation for this. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I slammed the car into reverse and sped back the way I came. The figures didn't chase me, but I could feel them still there, standing in the darkness, unmoving but ever present. When I finally reached the edge of the strange, endless fields, I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was home, locked in my room, the world outside seeming distant and foreign. To this day, I don't know what those figures were. Were they real? Were they something I imagined in my panic? All I know is that they were there, waiting, and they are still out there, somewhere. The day started like any other. I had been hiking on a trail deep in the mountains, a place I had visited countless times before. It was my usual escape, a chance to clear my head and breathe in the crisp mountain air. But something felt different that day, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for me to step further in. The trail twisted through towering trees, their branches arching over the path like ancient sentinels. I had always loved this trail. Its solitude, the sense of being far from the noise of the world. It was peaceful, or so I thought. I hiked for hours, the sound of my footsteps crunching beneath the dry leaves the only company. By midday, the sunlight had started to filter through the canopy, creating long, shifting shadows that danced along the forest floor. I paused, taking a swig of water from my bottle and looking around. The trees were older now, their trunks gnarled and thick, as though they had stood there for centuries untouched. That's when I heard it. A faint whispering, almost like the wind. But there was no wind. It came from deeper within the woods, soft and almost melodic. I strained to hear, but the whispering faded before I could make out any words. Shaking my head, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the quiet. But the whispering returned, this time louder, closer. It wasn't the wind, and now I was certain I wasn't alone. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I found myself moving cautiously, following the sound, though every instinct in me screamed to turn back. As I pressed deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in. The air grew colder, almost as if the forest itself was watching. My breath came in short bursts, each step feeling heavier than the last. The whispering had grown to a near silence, like something was speaking just out of reach, a voice that wanted to be heard but never could be. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but there, standing between two trees, was a figure. It wasn't tall, nor did it move like a human. Its shape was indistinct, like a mass of shadows pulled together. It seemed to be watching me, though its eyes, if it even had eyes, were dark, hollow voids. Fear tightened my chest, but I forced myself to stay still. The figure didn't move, didn't react to my presence. It just stood there, unmoving, like it had been waiting for me. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I couldn't look away. Then the whispering returned, more distinct this time. It wasn't words, but something deeper, something primal and ancient. The figure began to shift, its shape contorting and stretching in unnatural ways. It wasn't human, I knew that much, but it wasn't entirely creature either. Who are you? I whispered, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the whispering. Growing louder now, almost deafening. My head throbbed, the sound reverberating in my skull. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it would go away, but when I opened them again, the figure was closer. Its shadowy form had shifted again, growing darker, more defined. Panic surged through me and I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root. I fell, the rough ground scraping against my palms. I looked up, expecting to see the figure looming over me, but it was gone. The whispering faded, leaving only the sound of my own breath. Breathing heavily, I scrambled to my feet, my hands still trembling. I didn't dare look back as I made my way out of the woods. The trees seemed to watch me as I passed, their branches creaking, as if they knew I had been there. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead that I stopped. I turned to look back at the forest, but all I saw was the quiet, empty trees. The figure was gone, the whispering had vanished, but the feeling of being followed, watched, lingered. I never returned to that trail. Whatever had been waiting for me in those woods, I knew I could never escape it. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I can still hear the faint whispering, as if it's calling to me from the edge of the trees. It was a quiet night at the old cinema. I was the only one working, the projectionist. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The theater itself was a relic, built decades ago with worn-out seats and a projector that creaked like an old ship. The movies were rarely popular anymore, but the few people who still came were loyal, regulars who didn't seem to mind the dust and the dim lighting. I liked the quiet, the solitude, but tonight, something felt off. The last showing had ended hours ago, and now I was in the projection room, staring at the faint glow of the reel spinning. I was about to shut down the projector when I heard it, the faintest noise. A whisper, almost too soft to hear, coming from the hall below. I froze, listening. The theater had been empty for hours, or at least I thought it had. The whisper wasn't just in my head, it was real, distinct. It came again, a voice barely above a breath. Help. I leaned closer to the edge of the projection room, peering down into the darkness. The hall was still. Nothing. My heart raced as I hesitated, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the whisper came again, louder this time. Help. Please. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it wasn't from the films either. It wasn't part of the stories on screen. My breath caught in my throat, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I descended the stairs slowly, every step echoing in the vast, empty space. The whispers continued, now more distinct. I'm here. Please. I reached the main floor of the theater. The screen flickered faintly, casting long shadows in the dim light. The chairs were empty, just as they had been when the last film ended. Yet, the whispers came from the seats, as if someone, something, was sitting there. I moved cautiously toward the source of the voice. My eyes strained, trying to pierce the darkness. The whispers became clearer, more desperate. I can't get out. I turned my head, scanning the rows of seats, but saw no one. The whispers were getting louder, more insistent. They were coming from beneath one of the seats. Trembling, I knelt down and lifted the seat. Beneath it, there was nothing, only the cold, bare floor. But the whispers were louder now, echoing in my ears as if they had no source at all. Panic gripped me. I wanted to run, but something held me in place, rooted to the spot. The The whispers didn't stop. "Help. Please." Then, suddenly, there was silence, complete and oppressive. My heart was hammering, and I clutched my chest, wondering if I'd imagined it all. That's when I saw it. A faint outline of a figure on the far side of the theater, barely illuminated by the screen. It was a shape, taller than a person, its form blending with the shadows. No face, just an empty void where eyes should be. Before I could react, the figure moved closer, drifting silently across the room. It didn't walk. It glided, like smoke being pulled through the air. My breath caught again, and I stumbled backward, my hand brushing against something cold. I turned, only to find an empty row of seats behind me. When I looked back, the figure was gone. The theater was still empty. The screen blinked, casting distorted reflections of the room onto itself, but the whispers had stopped. I didn't stay long after that. I locked up and left, never looking back. I never heard those whispers again. The night it happened, I wasn't even supposed to be there. A few friends and I decided on a spontaneous trip to an abandoned train station. It was old, long forgotten, deep in the woods, miles from civilization. The place had always held a strange allure, a remnant from a past that seemed almost mythical. The tracks were overgrown, the station itself crumbling under years of neglect. We hiked out there with flashlights, excited for the eerie adventure. The walk felt normal at first, just trees, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet, and the sounds of creatures in the woods. It wasn't until we reached the station that the mood shifted. The first thing we noticed was the silence. It wasn't the typical woods silence, the kind where animals go quiet at dusk. This was deeper, as if the forest itself had gone still, like something had pressed pause on the world. Even our own voices felt muted, unnatural. We made our way inside the old building. The walls were stained with mildew, the air thick with the smell of decay. Broken benches and faded posters hung loosely from the walls. Graffiti covered most surfaces, scribbled warnings of danger and decay, but something about it felt different, wrong. We wandered further into the station, and that's when things started to feel off. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light of our flashlights. We heard faint whispers, too quiet to make out, but they seemed to be coming from inside the building, as if they were the echoes of something long gone. I looked at my friends, and we all shared uneasy glances, not sure if we were imagining it or if something truly was there with us. Then, from down the corridor, we heard it, a faint metallic clinking, like something was dragging along the floor. We froze. The sound came again, closer this time, like it was coming toward us. I signaled to my friends to stay still, but before we could even speak, the light flickered above us. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the station, and the air felt charged, like we were standing in the center of some unexplainable tension. We moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. The clinking grew louder, echoing off the cracked walls. It wasn't coming from one of us. Something was there. A figure emerged from the shadows, barely visible but unmistakably human-like. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, and it appeared more as a shadow than a person. I stepped back, heart pounding. My friends had already begun to whisper frantically, but none of us could make sense of what we were seeing. The figure didn't seem fully alive. Its skin was pale and stretched tightly over bones that looked too sharp, like they didn't belong. Its eyes were hollow, black as night, and it moved toward us without any sign of consciousness or intent. That's when we realized it wasn't human. Panic set in, but we didn't run. We couldn't. It was like the creature had already consumed the world around it, leaving only that suffocating silence. We turned to leave, but the door that had been open earlier was now shut. No breeze, no reason for it to have closed. The creature let out another growl, louder now, closer. We could hear its footsteps dragging along the floor as it approached. It didn't seem to care whether we ran or stayed. It didn't care if we lived or died. It wasn't moving with purpose, but with an unrelenting pull towards something. In that moment, it wasn't just fear that consumed me. It was confusion. What was this thing? What was it after? I don't know how much time passed before it stopped. The growling faded, and the dragging noise was gone. We didn't move. We didn't speak. The shadows grew darker, almost as if they were swallowing the faint glow of our flashlights. When we finally gathered the courage to look again, the station was empty. The door had opened. We walked out into the night, our breaths heavy, and we didn't look back. I've never gone back to that train station. I don't know what we encountered that night, and I don't think I want to. But every time I'm alone, there's always that thought. Whatever it was, it's still out there. It was a hot summer evening, and I had decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. The sun had set hours ago, leaving behind a deep, velvety darkness that seemed to stretch forever. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of a porch light, casting long shadows down the sidewalks. I lived in an old, quiet suburban neighborhood that had once been bustling, but now felt hollow and deserted. Most of the houses were dark, their windows blank and lifeless. As I walked, I noticed the silence. No chirping of crickets, no rustling leaves. It was unnaturally still. The only sounds were the faint echoes of my own footsteps against the cracked pavement. Halfway through my walk, I noticed something off about the house 2 doors down from mine. Its porch light was flickering, buzzing faintly, like it couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be on or off. The windows were dark, and there was a strange emptiness to the place, as if the house itself had been abandoned long ago. But the most unsettling part was the shape standing by the front door. A tall, thin figure cloaked in shadow. At first, I thought it was just the edge of a tree or a dark outline of the house. But then I saw it move. Slowly, deliberately. The figure didn't seem human. It wasn't walking like someone lost or wandering. It moved with purpose, as if it were waiting, watching for something. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't look away, even though every part of me wanted to turn and run. I wanted to shout, to call out, but something held me frozen in place. The figure tilted its head, staring in my direction. I could barely make out its outline, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. The way it stood so still, yet seemed entirely aware of my presence. Slowly, it began to move towards me, taking long, measured steps. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to scream, to flee, but my legs refused to move. I was trapped, rooted to the spot. The figure was almost close enough to make out its features when suddenly, without warning, it stopped. It stood there, facing me, just a few yards away. The silence stretched so thick I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Then, without any discernible reason, the figure spoke. Its voice was low, almost mechanical, like it had been recorded and played back. "You should not be here." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. I tried to take a step backward, but my body wouldn't move. The figure began to step closer again, and I could feel my panic rising. It tilted its head again, tilting toward me as if it was studying something. Then, almost too quietly to hear, it whispered, "You should have left already." Suddenly, everything snapped back into focus. My legs moved on their own, and I bolted down the street, adrenaline coursing through me. I didn't look back, not once, until I was safely back home, slamming the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The figure's words haunted me. I don't know what it was or what it wanted, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't human, and I pray I never see it again. It started as an ordinary trip to the local library. My sister and I were always close, and we spent countless afternoons browsing through rows of old, dusty books. That day, the library felt emptier than usual. The shelves towered over us, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the wooden floor as we walked. We had made our way to the back of the library, past the quiet study rooms and the dimly lit reading areas. The air smelled like old paper and dust. As we wandered further into the maze of bookshelves, I noticed how still everything was. No whispers, no children running, just silence. Even my sister seemed more subdued than usual. "I'll meet you over there," she said, gesturing toward a section I wasn't particularly interested in. I watched her disappear behind a row of shelves, lost in a world of her own. I kept browsing, pulling a book off the shelf and flipping through the pages. Something about the stillness was unsettling. The library wasn't big, but today it felt like a labyrinth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were the only ones there. I moved toward the back, deeper into the old section of the library where the shelves creaked beneath my feet. At the end of the row, something caught my eye. A table nestled in the corner, covered with old, dusty books. One of them wasn't like the others. The cover was worn, pages yellowed and brittle, but there was something different. Curious, I picked it up and dusted it off. The title was barely legible, faded with time. Whispers from the Void. My stomach sank. I opened the book, but the pages were blank, completely blank. A wave of unease washed over me, but I couldn't bring myself to put it down. As I flipped through the pages, a whisper escaped from the shadows behind me. I froze. The sound was faint. Just a whisper, but it wasn't from anyone I could see. The air shifted around me and I could feel eyes watching from the darkness. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the tall shelves stretching into the dim corners of the library. My heart thudded against my chest and I knew something wasn't right. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the silent aisles. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Only the low, endless whisper that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I clutched the book tightly and began to back away. I had to find my sister. I needed to get out of there. The whispering followed me, trailing like a shadow. I moved as quickly as I could, my breath hitching with every step. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, I heard my sister's voice from further down the hall. "Hey, what's going on? Are you okay?" Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Her voice sounded distant, echoing strangely. "I'm here," I yelled, but it felt hollow, as though my voice wasn't reaching her. "Where are you?" No response. The whispers grew louder, drowning out any trace of my sister's voice. I turned the corner, hoping to find her, but the library seemed to twist and stretch before my eyes. The rows of shelves seemed endless now, stretching far beyond what I remembered. "Please, just tell me where you are," I shouted, my voice breaking. Silence. And then I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hall, but something was wrong. Her figure wasn't quite right. Her back was arched unnaturally, and she wasn't moving like she usually did. It was as if she were floating. "Please come back," I cried, my legs trembling as I rushed toward her. But as I drew closer, I noticed her face. It wasn't my sister's. The eyes that stared back at me were hollow, empty, devoid of anything human. A sinister grin stretched across her lips. "No," I whispered, backing away. The whispers filled the air once more, louder now, like a chorus of unseen voices. The library seemed to stretch endlessly around me, each shadow deeper and darker than before. I turned to run, but the endless corridors shifted, moving as if the library itself was alive. I couldn't escape. Then, from the depths of the shadows, I heard a voice, calm, serene, yet undeniably chilling. "You're not supposed to leave." I closed my eyes, clutching the book to my chest. When I opened them again, everything was silent. The whispers had stopped. The library was still, eerily quiet. But when I turned around, my sister was gone. And so was the book. It was a quiet evening, and I was driving down a deserted highway. the kind where the road stretches endlessly with nothing but fields and trees on either side. I had been driving for hours, heading home after a long trip, and the dim glow of my headlights was the only source of light in the endless blackness around me. The air was thick with the scent of rain, though no storms had come. The tires hummed on the road, and the only sound was the rhythmic click of the wipers clearing the occasional drops from my windshield. I hadn't seen another car in hours, not since leaving the last town, and I felt that familiar sense of isolation creeping in. As I turned a bend, the first thing I noticed was the old wooden sign. It was weathered and barely legible, but I could make out the faint outline of the words, Eagle Point, 5 miles. I didn't remember seeing a town named Eagle Point on any map, but the sign wasn't particularly unusual, just another small forgotten place along this endless stretch of road. I was tempted to speed up, eager to get home, but something about that sign pulled me in. Curiosity, maybe, or the strange sense of solitude that had settled over the drive. I took a slow turn down the narrow, winding road that led toward Eagle Point. As I approached, the first thing I noticed was how dark everything had become. The streetlights in this part of the country were practically non-existent. The only light came from the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the night. Eagle Point wasn't much of a town. A few houses stood in various states of disrepair, the yards overgrown and dotted with wildflowers and weeds. There was no one outside, no cars, no movement, just a stillness that seemed to stretch forever. I drove slowly through the quiet streets, my senses on edge. That's when I saw the church. It wasn't like the other buildings. It was old, its steeple towering above the others, casting long, dark shadows across the ground. There was something unsettling about it, the way the windows reflected the light like hollow, staring eyes. I slowed down and parked across the street, unsure of why I felt so drawn to it. I stepped out of my car and walked toward the church. The ground was soft beneath my feet, the sound of crunching gravel echoing in the stillness. The door creaked open slightly as I pushed it, revealing the dim interior. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the faint light from my phone. The pews were empty, and the air smelled musty, old. The silence felt heavier here. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, like the church itself was holding its breath, waiting. I wandered further inside, drawn by an odd sense of fascination and dread. In one corner of the church, there was an old faded photo framed and sitting atop a small altar. It depicted a group of people, women, men, and children, standing together, smiling. But their eyes were empty, vacant. As I stared at the photo, I felt my skin crawl. The stillness grew deeper, more suffocating. Then, from the back of the church, I heard it. A faint whisper, too soft to understand, but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat and I turned slowly, heart pounding. There was nothing there, just shadows in the corners, stretching and shifting. I backed away from the altar toward the door. That's when I noticed something strange. The photo was gone. In its place was another photo, newly placed on the altar. This one showed me, alone, standing by my car with an empty, hollow stare. Panic gripped me as I snatched the photo and backed toward the door. The whispering had grown louder now, echoing through the church like 1,000 voices speaking at once. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was haunting. I stumbled outside, the door slamming behind me. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, my heart racing like it might burst. I drove as fast as I could, eyes locked on the road ahead. When I finally dared to look back, the church was gone, just empty fields stretching into the void. I never went back. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard. All I know is that some places aren't meant to be revisited. Some places leave you changed, and some places never really leave at all. It started as an ordinary Sunday drive through the countryside. I'd packed a few snacks, some music, and planned to spend the day exploring the old back roads, places I hadn't visited in years. The sun was shining, casting long shadows across the fields as I drove along, lost in the quiet hum of the engine and the occasional chirping of birds. My destination was a small, forgotten town deep in the woods. It wasn't marked on any maps or GPS. It was one of those places that only showed up if you knew where to look. I had vague memories of visiting there as a kid, but everything had changed since then. The road wound tighter into the trees, and as I drove deeper, the world felt as if it was folding in around me. I was eager for the quiet, for a break from the city, but the stillness of the woods began to feel oppressive, almost too quiet. It was as though the trees were watching, the silence pressing down like a weight. Eventually, I reached the old town, or what was left of it. Time had all but erased it. The town was overgrown with vines, the wooden houses leaning in on themselves, abandoned and forgotten. There were no signs of life, no people, no vehicles, just a faint echo of the past. I parked my car near the edge of what was once Main Street and started walking. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, cracked and covered in weeds. The air smelled damp and musty, like something had been left to rot. I passed the old general store, its windows broken and faded posters peeling away. I peeked inside and saw remnants of a life long gone, dusty shelves, faded signs, and the unmistakable scent of decay. Something about it made my skin crawl, but curiosity drove me forward. I wandered through the town, stumbling over old bricks and rusted metal, feeling as though I was stepping through a memory. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet, my footsteps echoing off the crumbling walls, the creak of dry wood, the distant call of birds. It was peaceful, yet unsettling. As the sun began to set, I reached the outskirts of town. I sat on an old stone bench, trying to take in the view of the overgrown fields and the distant horizon. The quiet seemed to stretch forever, the woods pressing closer with each passing moment. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first. A whisper. It wasn't human, but something inhuman. I froze, my heart pounding. I strained my ears, listening, but the woods remained silent except for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The whisper grew louder, as if it was circling around me, distant but persistent. I stood, my hands trembling, and turned in a slow circle, searching for the source. The woods were darkening, the last light of day vanishing behind the trees. Then, just beyond the edge of my vision, I saw it. Movement. A shadow, shifting among the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't look human. It was tall, too tall, and its figure twisted unnaturally as if it didn't belong in the world. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The whisper became a soft, eerie chant now, growing louder and more insistent. The figure moved closer, the shadow stretching and twisting as it approached. I could feel its presence, as if it were staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. It wasn't human, not in the way I knew. It was something older, something that had been waiting for a long, long time. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled backward. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation, but nothing made sense. The figure was no longer a shape, but a dark void, surrounding me in silence and fear. Just when I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, the whisper faded. The figure stood still for a moment, then turned, vanishing into the woods as silently as it had come. I stood there, trembling, as the night fully set in. The woods were silent once again, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. That thing, whatever it was still out there, watching, waiting. I slowly made my way back to my car, heart still racing. As I drove away, I glanced back at the town once more, the memories of the whisper still echoing in my mind. I haven't gone back since. It was late October, the leaves crunching beneath my feet as I made my way down the quiet country road. I had decided to take a long walk that evening, needing some fresh air away from the dull hum of city life. The sun was setting, casting long dark shadows over the rolling hills. and the only sound was the gentle rustling of trees in the breeze. I'd grown up in this area, a small town surrounded by farmland and open spaces. The woods were always eerie at night, but tonight felt different. The air was colder, heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I walked, I noticed how distant the usual sounds of animals had become. No crickets, no rustling of leaves, just silence. Even the wind had quieted. I reached the edge of the woods, the trees towering like silent sentinels on either side of the road. The sun had nearly set now, leaving only a dim orange glow on the horizon. It was too early to be this dark. That's when I saw it, standing between two trees, perfectly still, a figure watching me from the shadows. It was human-shaped, but there was something off about it. Its posture was wrong, unnatural. I stopped walking, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. I stood there, heart pounding, unsure if I should move or run. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It was like something out of a nightmare, just a shadow in the fading light. My legs felt frozen as I tried to look away, but something held my gaze. Who's there? My voice trembled as I forced the words out. The silence stretched on, and then nothing. No response, no sound of breathing, no movement. I wanted to run. I turned back toward the road, but as I did, I saw another figure appear in the distance, emerging from the opposite side of the woods. This one was even closer than I thought possible. It didn't walk, it glided, silently, effortlessly. My stomach twisted as I realized it wasn't human. The shape was wrong, distorted, like something had stretched it out of proportion. My mind raced as I backed away, hands trembling, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I was nearly at the edge of the road. The two figures, now several feet apart, stood motionless, their black, empty eyes staring toward me. I realized, with a sick feeling in my stomach, that I hadn't heard any footsteps, just silence. And yet they were there, both of them, in the middle of nowhere, watching me. I turned and ran, my legs carrying me as fast as they could, the figures vanishing into the darkness behind me. I never looked back. To this day, I don't know what they were, but I know they weren't human. It was a quiet summer evening when my family and I decided to visit the old abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. The place had been closed for years, overtaken by weeds and forgotten rides rusting in the hot sun. The locals had always whispered strange stories about the park, rumors of eerie sounds, forgotten laughter, and ghostly apparitions. But we figured it'd be a fun adventure, something different from the usual weekend routines. As we arrived, the first thing that struck me was how still everything felt. There wasn't even the usual hum of insects, just a deathly silence. The entrance gate was broken, hanging open, as though it had been waiting for us. We made our way inside, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet echoing unnaturally loud. The park was larger than I had imagined, with rows of rides that looked like they had been forgotten by time. There was something eerie about the way the rides loomed over us, standing still, lifeless. The Ferris wheel sat motionless, its metal skeleton creaking as though it wanted to move, but couldn't. The funhouse with its broken windows looked like a hollow, crooked mouth, waiting to swallow whatever dared enter. We wandered through the park, taking it all in. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating. There was a strange smell, something metallic, mixed with decay. My dad insisted we move closer to the central plaza where the old carousel still stood. It was one of the last working attractions before the park shut down. But it wasn't just the carousel that caught my attention, it was the voices. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, whispering soft murmurs. But as we approached the plaza, I realized the sounds were coming from the carousel itself. A soft, eerie laughter. The kind of laughter that didn't belong in a place like this. Probably just the wind, Dad said, though his voice was quieter now, uncertain. But the laughter continued. Clearer, louder. It wasn't the wind. I stopped, frozen in my tracks. The sound came from the empty carousel, the horses frozen mid-gallop, their painted faces worn and cracked. I could hear them, soft, childlike giggles, high-pitched and wrong, echoing across the dead park. Mom tried to assure me it was nothing. "It's just the old ride settling," she said, though her voice was shaky. But the laughter grew, becoming more distorted, more human. It didn't sound like kids playing. It sounded like something wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My skin crawled. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was as if something was there, something else. Dad grabbed my hand and pulled me along, saying we needed to leave, but something about that laughter kept following us. We rushed toward the exit, passing the old concession stand. But then, just as we neared the gate, the air grew colder. The silence became louder again, like a vacuum. That's when I noticed it. The Ferris wheel, still sitting there, its broken lights flickering. Only, it wasn't empty anymore. At the top of the Ferris wheel, a figure stood, motionless, staring down at us with hollow, empty eyes. There was no face, no features, just a void where the eyes should be. And that laughter, that awful, distorted laughter, came from it. I turned to my family, screaming to run, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. The Ferris wheel lights stopped flickering, plunging the park back into darkness. We didn't look back. We didn't stop. We got into the car and drove away as fast as we could, the laughter still ringing in my ears. To this day, I don't know what we saw, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever was there, it wasn't human, and it never left that amusement park. I've always loved the forest. There's something about being surrounded by towering trees, the fresh air, and the quiet that draws me in. So, when my friends suggested a weekend camping trip deep into the woods, I didn't hesitate. It sounded perfect, peaceful, serene, just what we needed to escape from the chaos of city life. We packed up our gear, grabbed some supplies, and hiked several miles into the heart of the forest. The trail was narrow, winding, and covered in fallen leaves, but the scenery was breathtaking. As we set up camp, I remember how quiet everything felt. No distant sounds of cars, no faint hum of electricity, just us and the wilderness. The first night was uneventful. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and sat around, laughing and enjoying each other's company. I had never felt more at peace. But when we decided to turn in, something shifted. That night, I kept waking up, hearing strange noises just beyond the trees. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the occasional hoot of an owl. These were softer, quieter sounds, almost like whispers. I brushed them off at first, telling myself it was just the wind, but something about the tone of those whispers felt wrong. Intimate, almost as though they were meant for someone, not just the forest. The second night, things felt different. I couldn't sleep at all. The forest had gone silent. Not the kind of silence you're used to when you're out in nature, but an unnatural, almost oppressive quiet. There wasn't a single sound from any creature. No crickets, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves. It was as if the forest had been drained of all life. At one point, I decided to step out of the tent and check the surroundings. The air was thick, almost suffocating. I shone my flashlight into the woods, expecting to see some critters or movement, but there was nothing. Just darkness. I called out to my friends, but my voice felt swallowed by the stillness. Then I saw it. Something standing far off, just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't a person, at least not a normal one. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and it didn't move like a human. Its silhouette was dark, almost blending into the night, but the more I stared, the more I felt like its presence was wrong. The air seemed to pulse around it, and I swear I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. I froze, my breath hitching. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It didn't seem curious. It didn't feel human. It felt watchful in a way that made my skin crawl. I backed away, slowly retreating into the tent, my heart racing. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound, every rustle of leaves made me flinch, but nothing else came. The next morning, my friends were awake, laughing, acting like nothing had happened. They didn't hear the whispers, didn't see the figure in the woods. When I told them, they just shrugged it off, calling me paranoid. I didn't press the issue. We packed up our gear, leaving the quiet forest behind us, still unsure of what we'd encountered. It wasn't until we were back in town that I realized something truly terrifying. I checked my phone. No service, as expected. But when I scrolled through my pictures from the trip, I froze at what I found. In the photos from the night before, something appeared. A faint, shadowy figure standing among the trees, barely visible but unmistakably there. It wasn't just a trick of the light or my imagination. It was real. And somehow, whatever it was, it had been watching us. I don't know what it wanted, and I never want to go back to that place. Some things are better left unseen. It was an ordinary Saturday when we decided to explore the old lake. It wasn't just any lake, it was surrounded by dense woods, hidden far from the main road. My friends and I had stumbled upon it years ago while hiking, but never spent much time there. Today, curiosity got the better of us. We packed a picnic and drove out, eager to spend the afternoon away from the usual noise of the city. The day was perfect at first. The sun was warm, the air was fresh, and the lake itself was calm and inviting. We set up our blankets near the shore, and for a few hours it felt like the world had stopped. We swam, took photos, and laughed under the canopy of trees. The forest around us seemed alive, buzzing with insects and birds. But there was something else, something that felt off. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lake, we began to hear faint whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time, like voices carried from the depths of the woods. I turned to my friends, but none of them seemed to hear it. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They shook their heads, focused on the lake. I stood up, looking toward the trees. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and now I was certain I wasn't imagining it. They weren't words, just faint, distorted murmurs, like something from a dream, calling out from the forest. "We should go back," I said, my heart starting to race. The feeling of unease was creeping in, swallowing any sense of peace we had earlier. "No way," one of my friends laughed. "We've got another hour of daylight, we're fine." I hesitated, wanting to stay but feeling that nagging, primal instinct to get out. Still, we stayed a little longer, hoping the sounds would fade. But they didn't. It was like the forest was alive, its very trees whispering to each other. The murmurs were all around us now, growing louder, almost like they were speaking directly to us. One of my friends, Mark, turned white as he stared at the woods, his eyes wide and searching. "I swear I hear something," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not normal." I glanced at the others. None of them seemed to be reacting as strongly, but I could see the tension in their faces. The air had turned colder and the woods were shifting. Silent one moment, then alive with rustling leaves and distant sounds. The sun had disappeared behind the horizon, casting the area in shadows. Everything seemed to grow darker, more foreboding. Mark stood up, his voice barely audible. "We need to go. Now." The others agreed, though reluctantly. We quickly packed our things, keeping our eyes on the trees, half expecting something to emerge from them. The whispers grew louder as we walked toward the car, but no one spoke, too caught up in the creeping dread. When we reached the car, I turned back one last time, searching the forest for any sign of life. That's when I saw it, just a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It wasn't human, though. It was long and twisted, like a shadow, but with shape. It vanished in an instant, but I knew it had been watching us. My friends didn't see it, and I didn't say a word. I just got in the car, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. We drove away from the lake in silence, leaving the strange murmurs behind us. As we drove back toward the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us from the darkness. I've never been back to that lake, and I never planned to. Whatever was out there, it felt alive, watching, waiting. And I know now, some things are better left unexplored. It started with the sound of dripping water. I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone like any other night. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I live alone, so when I first heard it, I thought maybe it was the refrigerator or the old pipes settling. I got up and checked the kitchen, but the dripping didn't seem to be coming from there. I stood still, listening, and it was coming from upstairs. I didn't think much of it at first. Old houses settle, right? Water can be unpredictable. But the sound persisted, steady and rhythmic. A slow, steady drip that seemed to echo throughout the empty house. I made my way upstairs, my footsteps quiet on the carpet, and checked the bathroom. No leaks. The sound was faint but clear now, coming from the end of the hallway. I stood there, staring down the dark corridor, wondering if maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, it wasn't in my head. It was too consistent, too real. I slowly pushed open the door to the guest room at the end of the hall. That was where the sound was loudest. The room was dark, dusty, and untouched. I flicked on the light switch and the faint glow illuminated the space. The room had been unused for years. An old dresser, a dusty bed frame, and a broken lamp in the corner. Nothing had changed. I listened again. The dripping was definitely coming from inside the room, but this time it wasn't coming from a pipe. It was coming from the closet. I took a deep breath, my pulse quickening, and slowly made my way toward it. The sound of my own breathing seemed louder than the drip, drip, drip. My hand hesitated on the closet door, and then I pulled it open. The inside was dark and empty, except for something unexpected, a single wet patch on the floor. A puddle, but not a puddle of water. It shimmered in the dim light, almost like it wasn't water at all. I knelt down, my heart racing, and touched it. My fingers sank into the substance. It was cold, sticky, and unidentifiable. I pulled my hand away, wiping it on my jeans, and stared into the closet. That's when I saw it. Just a glimpse at first. A shape, a figure standing at the back of the closet, facing away from me. It didn't move, didn't react. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of a figure distorted and shifting in the dim light. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just stared, unable to look away. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my body wouldn't move. The silence stretched on, and then, slowly, the figure turned toward me. Its face wasn't human. No eyes, no features, just void. A hollow, dark space where a face should have been. I could feel its gaze on me, and that's when I realized it wasn't there for water or pipes or anything rational. It had been there for me. I forced myself to turn and stumble out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The dripping sound still echoed through my house, but this time, it felt like it was coming from inside me. I still live in that house. The dripping never stopped. I've learned to ignore it, but sometimes, when the house grows too quiet, I swear I can hear the faint sound of footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. It was just a normal Sunday afternoon, and I had decided to take a long drive out to the outskirts of town. The weather was crisp and clear, the kind of day that makes you want to get away from the noise of the city. I hadn't been out this way before, but something about the empty roads and open fields had always called to me. I drove down winding country roads, surrounded by endless fields of tall grass. It was so quiet that the only sounds were the hum of the car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The air smelled fresh, and for once there was no one around. I appreciated the peace, letting my mind wander. As I drove, I noticed an old barn sitting off in the distance. It wasn't much, just a weathered wooden structure surrounded by overgrown weeds, but something about it tugged at me. I couldn't quite explain why, but I felt an inexplicable pull toward it. So I decided to take a detour, leaving the main road behind. When I parked and stepped out of the car, the silence was overwhelming. It wasn't a comforting silence, though. It felt oppressive, as if the very earth was holding its breath. I approached the barn cautiously. The wood creaked beneath my feet as I made my way closer. The door hung open slightly, swinging faintly in the breeze. I hesitated but stepped inside. The interior was dark, lit only by the faint slivers of sunlight that managed to filter through cracks in the old wood. The place smelled like damp hay and decay. My footsteps echoed, the sound amplified in the stillness. The barn wasn't empty. In the far corner, partially hidden by shadows, stood something tall and thin. I wasn't sure what it was. At first, I thought it was just old farm equipment or debris. But as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't. It wasn't human, but neither was it entirely unfamiliar. Its form was elongated, with arms that seemed too long, bending unnaturally. Its face, if you could call it that, was hollow and void, no features to speak of, just a black void where the eyes should have been. It stood completely still, like a statue, as if waiting. My heart raced. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't move. It felt like the barn had shifted, trapping me in a place with some unseen force. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It simply stood there, watching. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice in the way we think of it. It was more of a whispering thought that seemed to echo inside my own head. "Why are you here?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The barn door creaked louder, and I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. The oppressive silence returned, but now there was something else. Something watching. The figure in the corner shifted, just slightly, as if it had taken a step toward me. My legs finally moved, carrying me in a frantic stumble toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I looked back, catching a glimpse of something in the shadows. It wasn't just the figure now. There were more, a dozen, maybe more, standing motionless in the dark corners of the barn, all watching me with those empty voids for eyes. I couldn't escape them. The door wouldn't open. I turned back, heart pounding, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The barn felt like it was closing in, folding around me. Then I saw it, the face of one of them. So close now. It was right in front of me, and still it didn't have eyes, just a featureless black void. And yet, I felt it staring deep into me, past my skin and into my soul. The whisper came again. Louder now. "Why are you here?" This time, I heard my own voice answer, trembling and weak. I don't know, but I did know. I knew something had been waiting for me. It wanted something, something I couldn't understand. In that moment, I realized that leaving the barn wasn't an option, and neither was forgetting. It was supposed to be a simple trip. A group of friends and I decided to spend the day at the lake, looking forward to some sun, swimming, and grilling burgers. We had rented a small cabin by the water, tucked away from the main shore, surrounded by tall trees. The plan was to relax and enjoy the quiet, but things quickly went south. We arrived early in the morning, and the place was exactly as we'd pictured: peaceful, remote, far from the noise of civilization. We set up camp near the lake, took out the boats, and spent the first half of the day swimming and joking around. The water was cool and refreshing, and we all felt content. Around midday, we decided to take a hike along the trail that followed the shoreline. The trees stretched high above us, casting long shadows over the dirt path. We walked for about an hour, laughing and pointing out strange-looking rocks or trees that had been twisted by the wind. It was nice, peaceful even. That's when it happened. We came across an old weathered sign that pointed off the trail. "No trespassing," it read. We hesitated for a moment, unsure if we should follow it. Curiosity got the better of us, and one of us, the bravest or perhaps the most reckless, led the way. The trail disappeared into thick undergrowth. The trees grew closer together, blocking out most of the sunlight. It was eerily quiet now, with only the faint rustling of leaves as the wind shifted. We walked for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing down on us. Suddenly, we stopped. The trail ended abruptly in front of us, but it wasn't just a dead end. It was as if something had been cleared away, as though we weren't meant to go any further. The ground was packed hard, with claw marks etched into the earth as if something had been dragged through there. My stomach twisted at the sight. We turned back, uneasy now. As we retraced our steps, we realized the forest felt wrong. The air was thick, colder somehow, and the silence was oppressive. I could hear my friends breathing, each breath sharp and shallow. The usual sounds of birds and insects had vanished. When we made it back to the lake, the cabin was still in sight, but something had changed. The sunlight seemed dimmer, the air colder. It wasn't until we were nearly back that we noticed it. Someone had followed us. At first, I thought it was just one of our own shadows, but when I turned to glance behind us, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, far away but clear enough to make out. It wasn't moving, just watching. We didn't speak. We just bolted toward the cabin, leaving the figure behind. Inside, we locked all the doors and windows, hearts racing. We tried to convince ourselves it was just someone from a neighboring cabin, maybe a hiker who had wandered off trail. But deep down, we knew better. The figure had been watching us, waiting. The rest of the day passed in a blur of silence and paranoia. We didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin made us jump. We knew whatever had followed us was still out there, waiting in the dark. By morning, the figure was gone, but the fear remained. Whatever had followed us wasn't human, or at least not anymore. It was late at night, and I was driving home from a family gathering. The roads were mostly empty, the only sound being the occasional hum of my tires on the asphalt. I wasn't particularly familiar with this route. My usual path was blocked off due to some road work, but it was the quickest detour I could take. As I drove deeper into the countryside, the landscape changed. The city lights faded behind me, leaving only dark fields and dense trees. The silence grew oppressive. I had this strange feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, but I brushed it off, convincing myself I was imagining things. About 20 minutes into the detour, I passed a small, ancient-looking church. Its steeple pierced through the night sky, its silhouette standing stark against the dim moonlight. The church looked abandoned, with vines creeping up its sides, and the windows were shattered, filled with dirt and cobwebs. I shivered despite the warm breeze. As I drove by, my headlights briefly illuminated the graveyard surrounding the church. Tombstones leaned at odd angles, some half buried in the earth. The whole scene felt eerily still, like it wasn't part of this world. I tried to shake the unease that settled in my stomach and pressed on, telling myself it was just an old church. It was the next turn that unnerved me. The road curved sharply into a dense forest. The trees loomed high, their branches interlocking like dark claws above me. The air grew colder, and I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. My headlights barely cut through the fog that had begun to roll in. I slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The feeling that I was being watched grew stronger. I kept telling myself I was overthinking things, but my pulse quickened with each passing second. Then I heard it, faint but unmistakable. A low, hollow whispering. It was so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it, but it repeated, clear as day. Follow. I froze. The whisper wasn't coming from inside the car. It seemed to be carried on the wind. drifting from the trees around me. My fingers went numb as I clutched the steering wheel tighter. I scanned the forest, searching for the source, but the trees were motionless, their shadows stretching endlessly. Follow. This time, it was closer. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to drive away, but my foot wouldn't move. I didn't know if it was fear or something else keeping me there. Suddenly, my headlights flickered. The noise of the engine seemed to fade into the whispering. I could barely hear the tires on the road beneath me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible through the thick fog. Its outline was dark and impossibly tall. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I should have turned around then, should have left, but my body felt paralyzed. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. Follow. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Without thinking, I found myself inching the car forward, the figure still staring, unmoving. It was like it was beckoning me, luring me deeper into the unknown. I don't know how long I drove. The road twisted and turned, every mile feeling longer than the last. The whisper didn't stop, growing louder, as if I were being led deeper into the woods, into whatever nightmare lurked ahead. Finally, the whisper faded. The trees grew thinner. The fog cleared slightly, and I found myself driving onto a dirt path. Ahead of me was a clearing, bathed in moonlight. In the center stood the church, its shattered windows now gleaming with an otherworldly glow. My heart pounded as I realized the figure was gone. I hesitated, my hands still gripping the wheel, but something compelled me to stop. I didn't know why. My legs felt like they were moving on their own. I stepped out of the car, the ground beneath my feet cold and wet. I approached the church, the whisper now replaced by silence. My footsteps echoed in the stillness. When I reached the church, I stared at the cracked entrance, frozen with fear. But there was nothing. No figure, no whispers, no voices, just an old, abandoned church standing in the cold, dead night. And as I turned to leave, I realized the face I had seen in the cracked window wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone's. The day had started off ordinary, just another lazy afternoon. I decided to explore the old abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a place everyone whispered about but no one dared to enter. The house had always been shrouded in mystery, sitting at the edge of the forest like a relic from another time. The locals said strange things happened there, whispers in the night, disappearing pets, shadows in the corners of windows. I parked my car on the gravel path and made my way toward the house. The old wooden planks groaned beneath my feet, each step echoing eerily in the quiet. The front door creaked open without much resistance, revealing a dark, empty interior. Dust covered everything and the air smelled of decay. I walked through the rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. Furniture had been overturned, and old photos lay scattered on the floor, their faces faded beyond recognition. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath my weight. As I wandered deeper into the house, I began to hear something. Faint whispers, barely audible but persistent. I paused, holding my breath, straining to make out what they were saying. It was almost like the house itself was murmuring secrets, as if the walls were alive with memories. I shook off the chill that ran down my spine and pressed on. The whispers grew louder as I reached the top of the staircase. They seemed to be coming from the room at the end of the hall. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed open the door. Inside, the room was bare except for an old mirror standing in the corner. It was cracked, its glass dull and warped. I couldn't look away, compelled by some strange force. As I stared into the mirror, I saw my reflection distort, my face twisting, becoming something wrong. The whispers became screams, louder now, echoing in my ears. I stumbled back, the distorted figure in the mirror now staring at me, its hollow eyes gleaming. I could feel it watching me, not just in the reflection, but in the real world. My breath came in shallow gasps and I backed away from the mirror, tripping over the furniture as I fled the room. As I ran down the hall, I glanced behind me and caught a glimpse of something, a shadow, black and shifting, racing after me. I could hear it breathing, ragged and uneven, closing the distance between us. I burst out of the house, the door slamming shut behind me. The air outside was thick, oppressive, and silent once again. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I've never returned to that farmhouse. The whispers still echo in my ears, and sometimes I swear I see that shadow lurking just at the edge of my vision. Whatever was in that house, whatever was chasing me, it's still there, waiting. I'll never forget that summer evening. It was just a normal family trip, something we did every year, driving out to the old orchard just outside town. My parents, my siblings, and I. We had always gone there to pick fruit, sit beneath the trees, and enjoy the quiet, rural countryside. The orchard had been there for as long as I could remember. Rows of apple trees stretching out into the distance, their branches heavy with fruit. My family had visited so many times over the years that I hardly noticed the quiet, the rustling of leaves, or the way the sunlight filtered through the trees in that peaceful rhythm. That night felt different from the start. The sky was painted in soft shades of orange and pink, but it wasn't just the beauty of the setting sun that was off. It was the stillness. Even the air felt thick, like something was holding its breath. We parked the car under the massive oak near the entrance, the old wooden sign creaking as the wind blew through it. My parents were excited, chatting about how many baskets we would fill while my younger brother and sister ran ahead toward the trees. I lagged behind, lost in my own thoughts. It wasn't long before I noticed how eerily quiet the orchard was. No birds, no rustling leaves. It felt like the world had been muted, as if the usual sounds of nature had been snuffed out. I glanced around, but there was no breeze, no rustling, no movement of any kind. Even the ground beneath my feet seemed strangely still. As I followed my family deeper into the rows of trees, I started to feel a creeping sense of unease. My siblings' laughter faded away, replaced by a strange silence. I could hear their footsteps ahead of me, but the normal sounds of nature were gone. The air felt too still, almost too heavy. When I caught up with them, I noticed my brother and sister standing frozen, staring at something a few yards ahead. I followed their gaze and froze too. In the distance, there was a figure. It wasn't human, but something wrong. Tall and gaunt, its limbs moved unnaturally like they were too long, too stiff. Its head tilted sharply toward us, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't moving like a person. Its movements were jerky, mechanical, almost like it didn't understand how to walk properly. It took one slow step toward us, and I noticed it wasn't wearing any clothes. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and stretched tautly over its bones. I wanted to run, scream, do anything, but I was frozen. The figure didn't make any sound, just continued to advance slowly. My brother and sister didn't move, their eyes wide with fear. My parents were oblivious, still walking ahead, chatting like everything was normal. I finally found my voice. "Mom! Dad!" I shouted, my voice shaking. "Something's out here." They turned, faces puzzled. "What are you talking about?" my mom asked, but when they saw the figure, their smiles dropped. My dad's expression went blank and my mom let out a small gasp. "Stay back," my dad said, his voice low and sharp. "Everyone, stay together." The figure took another step closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. It didn't seem hostile, just wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be there. We all took a step back, trying to back away from it. The creature stopped a few feet away, tilting its head in that disturbing, unnatural way. Its hollow eyes seemed to be searching for something, or someone. "We need to get out of here," my dad said urgently. His voice trembled as he turned to lead us back to the car. My mom grabbed my brother and sister, pulling them along as we hurried through the orchard. But as we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still watching us. I dared to glance back and saw it standing there, unmoving, as though rooted to the spot. When we made it to the car, my dad slammed the door shut, and we drove away as fast as we could. The figure never moved, never followed. It was just there, standing in the stillness of the orchard. I looked back through the rearview mirror one last time. It was still there, standing perfectly still, the sun finally disappearing behind the trees. Even now, I don't know what we saw that night, but whatever it wasn't human, and it wasn't supposed to be in that orchard. And sometimes I still feel like it's watching, waiting, just as still and silent as it was back then. It was a late afternoon when I decided to take a walk through the old neighborhood. The sun was casting long shadows over the cracked sidewalks, and the air was thick with the smell of old wood and rust. This wasn't a place I usually visited. It had been abandoned years ago. Most of the houses were overgrown, their windows dark and the streets devoid of life. It was the kind of place where time had seemingly stopped. As I wandered further down the quiet, forgotten streets, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant creak of old fences swaying in the wind. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the stillness of the place playing tricks on me. But then I saw it. At first, only a shadow, but as I turned a corner, I froze. A figure was standing at the end of the street, barely visible against the fading light. It was tall, too tall, and its features were obscured by the deep shadows of dusk. I stood there, heart pounding, unsure of what to do. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. My first instinct was to turn and run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I told myself it was just someone lost, wandering through the old neighborhood like I was. Maybe they didn't know where they were either. But the way they stared at me, so still, so unnerving, made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't ignore. I forced my legs to move, taking slow, cautious steps toward the figure. As I got closer, I realized that there was something off about them. They didn't seem human. There was an unnatural stillness to their posture, as if they were frozen in place. And their eyes, they weren't reflecting any light, just pure, empty voids. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My throat was dry, and my mind felt clouded with fear. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. The figure tilted its head slightly as if studying me, and then took a step forward. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like it didn't belong in this world. I stumbled back, my breath hitching. This wasn't human. It couldn't be. I turned and ran, sprinting as fast as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't dare look behind me. I just kept running, fueled by pure panic. The sounds of my footsteps echoed off the empty streets, but no other sounds followed. No wind, no birds, no distant cars, just silence. The kind of silence that feels alive, watching. When I finally stopped, I was out of breath, my chest heaving. I stood there trying to gather my wits, but the eerie quiet of the neighborhood felt thicker than before. I dared to glance back, but the figure was gone. There was no trace of them, just the empty street stretching before me. I didn't go back into that neighborhood. I never will. Whatever it was, whatever I saw, I know I wasn't supposed to. It was the kind of day that felt too perfect to be real, the kind of day you only ever see in old photos or travel brochures. My friends and I decided to take a trip out to a secluded beach, tucked away from the usual tourist spots. We'd heard whispers of its beauty from a few locals, but no one really talked about what else might be there. We didn't care. We just wanted the peace and quiet. The drive there was uneventful, winding through winding, narrow roads that twisted through dense forests. The radio played softly, our conversations mellow, as we joked about what kind of adventures awaited us at the shore. It felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. We finally reached the beach in the late afternoon, the sun already low on the horizon. The sand stretched out in front of us, golden and untouched. The sound of the waves crashing on the shore was soothing. For the first time in a long time, we truly felt free. We spent the day swimming, building sandcastles, and exploring the tide pools. It was idyllic. But as the sun dipped further, casting long shadows across the sand, something started to feel off. The beach, once full of laughter and cheer, grew quiet. The air seemed to thicken, the usual comforting sounds of waves and birds fading into silence. It wasn't that we felt unwelcome, just uneasy, like something was watching. As the last light of the day faded, we gathered our things, feeling reluctant to leave the peaceful stretch of shore behind. I was about to suggest we head back when one of my friends, Laura, stopped dead in her tracks. "Wait, do you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaky. We all stopped and strained to listen. At first, it was just the sound of the ocean, but then I realized she wasn't talking about the waves. There was something else, a faint, rhythmic thudding, soft but insistent, like something hitting the ground just beyond the edge of the trees. "What is that?" I whispered, my stomach tightening. We couldn't see anything, just the dark silhouettes of trees looming beyond the beach. The sound grew louder, closer, and now I was sure I could hear another noise. Whispers. Low, unintelligible voices like they were murmuring right at the edge of hearing. "I think we should go," one of my other friends, Mike, said, his voice barely above a whisper. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Maybe someone's camping out there," Laura suggested, but her words trembled as she spoke. The thudding noise stopped abruptly and the whispers fell silent. A sudden chill swept through the air. It felt like something had just moved, watching us from the darkness. "I think we should go now," I said, my voice firm. The fear in the air was impossible to ignore. We started walking quickly toward the car parked at the edge of the forest. My mind was racing. What could have made that noise? What had those whispers been? As we neared the edge of the woods, something caught my eye. A figure just beyond the tree line. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching us. It was dark, featureless, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. I stopped, unable to look away. "Come on," Mike yelled from a few steps ahead. I blinked, shaking my head. The figure was gone. We piled into the car, driving quickly away from the beach. The silence inside was deafening, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. None of us spoke, each lost in our own thoughts. That feeling, the sensation of being watched, hadn't left any of us. It wasn't until we were back in town that Laura spoke up again, her voice breaking the silence. "I've never told anyone this, but when I was walking down the beach earlier, I saw something in the water," she said quietly. A face, floating beneath the surface. It wasn't human. We all fell silent. None of us had seen the face she mentioned, but somehow I wasn't surprised. What we heard, what we saw, whatever it was still there, watching from the shadows of the trees. To this day, I haven't returned to that beach. And I never will. I was on a road trip with my friends, driving through an unfamiliar desert. The sun was beating down on the cracked pavement, and the silence of the empty highway stretched endlessly ahead. We had been driving for hours. No signs of civilization in sight, just mile after mile of barren desert landscape. We were all growing restless, desperate for some kind of break from the monotony. The only thing in view was the occasional stretch of cracked road in the distant horizon, where the desert seemed to blend into the sky. My friends and I decided to pull off onto a small dirt track we'd seen about a mile back. The track led to an old abandoned building, once a gas station, now nothing but rubble and dust. The sun had bleached the place dry, leaving only broken windows and faded remnants of faded signage. It looked like it had been there for decades, forgotten by time. "We should check it out," Mark said, breaking the silence. We cautiously made our way through the debris, the crunch of our footsteps disturbing the quiet. The inside of the building was eerily quiet. The dust that coated everything made it feel like the place hadn't seen human presence in a lifetime. We explored the remains, poking through old cabinets and peeling wallpaper, but found nothing of any real value. That's when we noticed it. At first, we didn't know what it was. A faint metallic hum, like something electrical, coming from somewhere deeper inside the building. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't subtle either. We followed the sound down what was left of the hallway, the old wooden floor creaking beneath us. At the end of the hall, we found a door that was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, we saw a narrow staircase leading down into a dark basement. The hum grew louder as we descended, the air growing colder with each step. I could feel the tension rising in my chest, the kind that makes your skin crawl. The basement was a mess. Collapsed shelves, broken tools scattered across the floor. But the hum wasn't coming from any of that. It was coming from an old metal door at the far end of the room. The door was covered in rust with no visible handle. Mark walked toward it, his flashlight shaking slightly as he pointed it at the door. "What is this thing?" he muttered. I didn't know. None of us did. The hum grew almost unbearable as we got closer. My heart was pounding in my chest as I realized there was something on the other side. I reached out, placing my hand on the door. The noise stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt suffocating. I turned to the others, but they were frozen, staring at me like I was the only one who could move. Then something changed. A faint scraping noise began. It came from behind the door, slow and deliberate, as if something on the other side was dragging itself closer. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to. "Guys," I whispered, my voice trembling. Mark's eyes were wide, his flashlight now trembling more violently. "Open the door," he managed to choke out. I hesitated. I didn't want to. But the scraping was getting louder, the sound of something, or someone, dragging itself across the floor behind the metal door. Without realizing what I was doing, I turned the knob. The door swung open. There was nothing, at least not anything we could see. The room beyond was empty, just more dust, darkness, and a strange, inexplicable silence. But as I stepped forward, I felt something cold, like fingers brushing against my back. It wasn't just a sensation. It was as if something was there, something that didn't belong. My friends weren't behind me anymore. I turned to call out to them, but they were gone. The basement was empty and the metal door was still open behind me. I couldn't explain what happened. I never could. I looked for them after that, searched the entire area, but there was no trace. No sign of my friends, no footprints, nothing. To this day, I wonder what we found in that desert. Whatever it was, I hope I never see it again.
I'll never forget the day my family decided to take a trip to that old, abandoned amusement park. It was a place I had heard of, but never thought we'd visit. Set deep in the woods, far off any well-traveled roads, it was a relic from a bygone era, crumbling and overgrown with weeds. Most people said it was dangerous, but my parents thought it would be an adventure for us kids, something different from the usual summer trips. From the moment we parked the car, I felt a strange chill in the air. The once vibrant colors of the rides had faded to muted grays, and the silence that filled the place felt oppressive. The park looked like it had been abandoned for decades, yet something about it didn't sit right with me. My sister, laughing, tugged at my arm and insisted we explore. I could feel something watching me, something unseen, something waiting at last. I found my sister, huddled near what was once the park entrance. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I heard them," she whispered, "the voices. They're everywhere." We stayed there, holding onto each other, unable to move as the whispers grew louder, circling us, the laughter echoing in the distance. The old amusement park seemed alive, every creak of the wood, every rustling breeze sounding like a warning. When my parents finally found us, hours later, We were sitting together, too terrified to speak. The voices had faded, but the sense of something lingering had not. We never spoke about that day again. The amusement park remains hidden deep in the woods, abandoned, but the whispers, those remain with us, even now. My sister ran ahead, laughing and calling to me, until I couldn't hear her anymore. That's when the whispers started. I was sure I was imagining them at first. Soft, almost inaudible voices carried through the empty air faint murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I froze, listening intently, but there was nothing to see. Just the towering remnants of the old rides, the stillness, and that chilling silence. "Sarah," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I tried again, louder this time. "Sarah, where are you?" A knot formed in my stomach. I told myself she must have wandered ahead, but the fear wasn't about her. It was the way the park seemed to pulse around me, the silence now heavier than before. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard a faint voice, soft, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. "Turn back." I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. There was nothing but the empty Ferris wheel, its great skeletal arms stretching into the gray sky. I stood there, waiting, but there was nothing, only the wind stirring the dust around my feet. "Hello," I asked, but my voice sounded thin and distant, swallowed by the emptiness. Suddenly, the sound of laughter filled the air, high-pitched, childlike, but hollow. It echoed through the park, bouncing off the old rides, each bounce seeming to come from different directions at once. I ran, my legs moving faster than they ever had before, calling out for my sister. The laughter followed, growing louder, closer. I stumbled over twisted metal, fallen beams, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers had returned, louder this time. "Come closer." I wanted to scream, to run, but the park had become a maze of rusted remnants. The ground was uneven with debris. I could feel something watching me, something unseen, something waiting. At last, I found my sister, huddled near what was once the park entrance. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I heard them," she whispered, "the voices. They're everywhere." We stayed there, holding onto each other, unable to move as the whispers grew louder, circling us, the laughter echoing in the distance. The old amusement park seemed alive, every creak of the wood, every rustling breeze sounding like a warning. When my parents finally found us, hours later, we were sitting together, too terrified to speak. The voices had faded, but the sense of something lingering had not. We never spoke about that day again. The amusement park remains hidden deep in the woods, abandoned, but the whispers, those remain with us, even now. The evening sun dipped low, painting the sky in a wash of orange and pink as I stood in the middle of the field, staring out at the sprawling farm. The summer harvest was winding down, and I was finishing up my last task, picking a few late-season tomatoes. The air was warm but carried a faint, bitter tang that didn't sit right in my throat. I glanced around, trying to push the feeling aside. There was no reason for it. The farm was my sanctuary, a place where nothing could go wrong. I'd been working on my uncle's farm for years. It was familiar, predictable, and usually quiet except for the crows that would squawk and wheel in the sky. But tonight, something was different. The field behind the barn was where I always finished my day. I loved the rhythmic rustle of the tall corn stalks and the occasional cricket chirping, a sound that calmed me down after a long day. But today, the corn didn't move with the wind. It stood still, like it was holding its breath. I swallowed hard, feeling that strange, electric tingle creep up my spine. "Hey, are you out there?" My uncle's voice cut through the silence, startling me. I turned and saw him at the edge of the porch, the silhouette of his wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. I raised a hand to show I was still working, but then something caught my eye. Just beyond the corn, near the tree line, something moved. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it didn't move like one. It was too slow, too deliberate. I squinted, trying to see better. but the light was fading fast. That's when I saw an arm, pale and thin, poking out from between the stalks. It was just an arm, no body, no head, yet it seemed to be reaching for something, fingers twitching as though testing the air. A shiver passed through me, and I dropped my basket, the tomatoes rolling across the dirt. "Uncle," I called, my voice shaking. He was already running towards me, but he stopped when he saw the arm. His expression shifted from concern to confusion, and then to something else I couldn't name. His eyes widened, and he glanced toward the woods before meeting my gaze. "You need to get inside now," he said, his voice low and rough. Before I could ask why, the arm pulled back into the cornfield, and a wet, spluttering sound followed. It was as though something was dragging itself, the thud of its movements muffled by the earth. The corn rustled violently, then fell silent again, a suffocating hush settling over everything. My uncle grabbed my arm, pulling me towards the porch. "Inside," he said, more urgently this time, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot. A scream tore through the air, sharp and strangled. It wasn't human. It was like an animal, but worse, deeper, guttural. My body froze, but my mind raced, fighting the instinct to run. I glanced back toward the field, my uncle's grip digging into my arm. There, standing at the edge of the corn, was a figure. It was pale, emaciated, its limbs too long and crooked. It didn't have a face, just a void where I should be, a black, empty space that seemed to pulse in the dim light. Then it moved, not toward us, but sideways, disappearing into the woods, the corn behind it shivering as it passed. I staggered back as the last light of the day slipped below the horizon. I swallowed hard, feeling that strange, electric tingle creep up my spine. "Hey, are you out there?" My uncle's voice cut through the silence, startling me. I turned and saw him at the edge of the porch, the silhouette of his wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. I raised a hand to show I was still working, but then something caught my eye. Just beyond the corn, near the tree line, something moved. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it didn't move like one. It was too slow, too deliberate. I squinted, trying to see better, but the light was fading fast. That's when I saw an arm, pale and thin, poking out from between the stalks. It was just an arm, no body, no head, yet it seemed to be reaching for something, fingers twitching as though testing the air. A shiver passed through me, and I dropped my basket, the tomatoes rolling across the dirt. "Uncle." I didn't look back, couldn't. The sound of my footsteps faded into the endless crashing of waves. But the figure was still there, moving, growing closer with every step I took. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, slamming the door shut behind me. I fumbled to start the engine, my hands trembling. When I finally glanced up, the figure was gone, but I swear, I still feel its eyes watching me every time I close my eyes. I can see it. It's not something I can explain, but I know one thing for sure. It wasn't human. The sun had long since set, leaving behind nothing but darkness. I carried a flashlight but barely needed it, as the faint glow of the moon guided me enough. The beach was deserted, just the way I liked it. I walked for what felt like hours, letting my thoughts wander with the rhythm of the tide. The waves lapped gently at the shore, creating a hypnotic sound that had always brought me a strange sense of calm. But that night, something felt off. The air wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. I kept glancing over my shoulder, a nagging sense of unease growing with each step. It wasn't until I reached the far end of the beach, where the sand met jagged rocks and the sea stretched out endlessly, that I noticed it. A figure, not far from where I stood, barely visible in the dim light. There was someone or something standing still, staring out at the ocean. I froze. My first thought was that it was another walker like myself, maybe someone else who had come to enjoy the solitude of the beach. But as I tried to make out more details, my stomach twisted in knots. The figure didn't move. It was just standing there, unmoving, as if frozen in time. The longer I stared, the more I felt the weight of its gaze. Though I couldn't make out any features, a chill ran down my spine. But I told myself to keep walking. There was no reason to panic. It could have been anyone, right? But as I took a step forward, the figure shifted slightly, turning ever so slightly in my direction. It wasn't a human movement, there was something unnatural about it, jerky and deliberate, like a puppet controlled by strings. The urge to turn and flee was overwhelming, but my feet wouldn't move. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart pounding. The figure continued to stare at me. There was no recognition, no sign of life, just that unrelenting, lifeless gaze. Then, without warning, the figure took a slow step forward. My body finally responded, and I turned and ran. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The sound of my footsteps faded into the endless crashing of waves. But the figure was still there, moving, growing closer with every step I took. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, slamming the door shut behind me. I fumbled to start the engine, my hands trembling. When I finally glanced up, the figure was gone, but I swear, I still feel its eyes watching me every time I close my eyes. I can see it. It's not something I can explain, but I know one thing for sure, it wasn't human. It was meant to be an ordinary day at the beach. I had been looking forward to it all week. The sun, the sound of the waves, the smell of salt in the air. I left the city early with a few friends, and we drove out to the coast. It was early enough that the beach was empty, just the way I liked it. We set up our towels, unpacked snacks, and played music while the waves rolled in and out. As the sun climbed higher, we swam and joked, letting the waves carry us like we were kids again. The water was colder than usual, but it felt refreshing against the sweltering heat. After an hour or so, I noticed something strange. Just past the line where the water met the sand, there was an area where the waves seemed to break differently. It looked as if the water was churning, moving in slow, jerky circles. I squinted at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a man, probably in his early 30s. He was flailing, waves crashing over him, pulling him deeper. I pushed forward, the water tugging at my legs, and reached out. I grabbed his arm, but when I tried to pull him closer, he went rigid, staring past me, eyes filled with pure, unbridled terror. "Don't turn around," he screamed, voice choked and panicked. I froze, but I couldn't stop myself from turning my head. What I saw made my blood run cold. A dark shape had emerged from beneath the water. It moved as if it were made of liquid, its surface shifting and undulating like oil. To hollow, black eyes stared at me, and I could feel its gaze, icy and ancient. It was a man, probably in his early 30s. He was flailing, waves crashing over him, pulling him deeper. I pushed forward, the water tugging at my legs, and reached out. I grabbed his arm, but when I tried to pull him closer, he went rigid, staring past me, eyes filled with pure, unbridled terror. "Don't turn around," he screamed, voice choked and panicked. I froze, but I couldn't stop myself from turning my head. What I saw made my blood run cold. A dark shape had emerged from beneath the water. It moved as if it were made of liquid, its surface shifting and undulating like oil. To hollow, black eyes stared at me, and I could feel its gaze, icy and ancient. A gaping mouth split its face, filled with rows of jagged teeth. My breath caught, and the man screamed again. He pulled away from me, but it was too late. The water shifted, and he was gone, dragged under in an instant. The surface of the water settled as if nothing had happened, leaving only ripples behind. I stumbled backward, nearly falling into the water, and scrambled to get out. I didn't even look at my friends, who were now staring at me, eyes wide with confusion and fear. I ran up the sand, heart pounding, the air around me thick with salt and panic. I didn't stop until I was safe in my car, locked inside, staring back at the beach. The ocean was calm again, nothing out of the ordinary, as if the man and the thing in the water had never been there, but I'll never forget the sound of his last scream or the black, hungry eyes that had looked at me from beneath the waves. They were still there, waiting, just below the surface. The street was dark, except for the occasional flicker of the street lamps that barely cut through the night. I had taken the long way home from my friend's house, down the quiet back roads that winded through patches of woods. The air felt heavy, and the silence outside my car was suffocating, as if the world were holding its breath. I was about halfway home when the car's headlights caught a figure standing at the edge of the road. I hit the brakes, the tires squealing in protest as I stopped just inches from what I now saw was a woman. She was wearing a long, flowing white dress that looked like it belonged to another era. Her hair was dark, tangled, and her face was turned away from me, looking down at the pavement. I rolled the window down, the cold air biting at my skin. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice uncertain. The woman didn't move or respond. I squinted, trying to make out her face, but the shadows hid it. A chill ran through me, but I told myself I was being silly. Maybe she was lost, maybe in trouble. Just as I was about to call out again, she turned. The face that met my eyes was pale and cracked, like an old porcelain doll. Her eyes were black and hollow, and the corners of her mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too far. My heart clenched. Without thinking, I threw the car into reverse and sped away, glancing back in the rearview mirror. The woman was standing still, unmoving, watching as the distance grew between us. The last thing I saw was her head tilting to the side, an unsettling, broken motion. I didn't take the usual way home after that. I drove faster, glancing over my shoulder, ears straining for the sound of footsteps, or worse, the whisper of someone breathing behind me. The radio crackled, the only noise besides the sound of tires on pavement, and I twisted the dial, searching for something that would chase away the tightness in my chest. Suddenly, my headlights caught something else, another figure, this time in the middle of the road. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes, his hair matted and eyes sunken. He raised a hand, motioning for me to stop. I didn't. I slammed my foot on the gas, my car roaring as it sped past him. In the rearview mirror, the man and the woman stood side by side, staring. A sharp, inhuman cry broke the night, and I couldn't help but shudder. The road ahead was dark, unlit except for the dim glow of the moon. I turned left at the next intersection, taking a path that led deeper into the woods. I knew it wasn't the right choice, but the thought of going back that way was worse. The trees pressed in on me, their branches clawing at the car as if trying to pull me out. I drove faster, ignoring the warning signs that read dead end. I didn't care. I had to get away. But as I rounded the bend, the road stopped abruptly, and the car skidded to a halt at the edge of a shallow, rocky ravine. I slammed my hands against the wheel, breathing fast, eyes darting around. In the darkness, I saw movement. 3 figures, no longer at the edge of the road but in the clearing behind me. Their faces were pale, eyes dark and hollow. The woman in white stepped forward, and a voice, soft and cold, whispered from the shadows, "Leave this place." I didn't hesitate. I threw the car into drive and sped forward, ignoring the gravel bit at the tires. The figures didn't follow. I didn't look back as the trees blurred past, but I knew they were watching, waiting, and whatever they were would always be there, hidden in the dark corners of the woods. The rest of the drive home was a blur. My mind screaming for me to stop thinking, stop looking over my shoulder. When I finally made it to my house, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. I stumbled inside, locking the door behind me, and drew the curtains tight. The world outside was safe, or so I thought. The next morning, when I went to leave for work, I noticed the street was silent, as if it had never been touched by light or life. And when I looked out the window, I saw the woman in white standing across the road, staring at me, eyes hollow, mouth cracked in that twisted grin. I knew I'd never be the same again. The silence outside whispered that they were still there, waiting for the night. I had never been a fan of hiking, but I agreed to go with my friend on a spontaneous day trip to the forest. She promised the views would be worth it. We packed a few snacks, filled our water bottles, and set off before dawn. the crisp morning air stinging my cheeks as we climbed the narrow trail. The woods were dense, the trees towering over us and blocking out the sky. As we walked, I felt like we were moving through a different world, one where the usual sounds of birds and insects were swallowed by unnatural silence. My friend was ahead, her voice ringing out as she pointed out different plants and birds, but I wasn't listening. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Around midday, we stumbled upon a clearing that seemed perfect. A small, crystal clear stream cut through the middle, flanked by wild flowers that looked too vibrant, too alive. The air felt heavier here, almost electric. I reached for my water bottle and drank, taking a moment to catch my breath. My friend sat on a mossy rock, pulling out a sandwich. That's when I heard a faint, rhythmic thumping, like distant drumming. I turned, searching for its source, but the forest was still and silent. My friend didn't seem to notice, focused on her sandwich, but the sound was growing louder, closer. It wasn't natural, not the sound of wildlife. It was deliberate, as though someone was tapping on something wooden, sending shivers down my spine. "Hey," I said, my voice tight. "Do you hear that?" My friend looked up, her brow furrowing. "What?" "The drumming," I said, but as I said it, the noise stopped. It was so sudden that it made the hairs on my arms stand up. We exchanged a quick glance, the kind that doesn't need words to say you're both terrified. But then, as if on cue, the sound resumed, louder and clearer than before. "It's coming from over there," I whispered, pointing toward the tree line on the far side of the clearing. We packed up quickly, the sense of urgency gnawing at my nerves. We began walking back the way we'd come, but the sound followed us, the thumping now joined by whispers. Low and unintelligible. It wasn't just following us, it was moving with us. I could feel my pulse racing, every step echoing like a drumbeat in my chest. The forest seemed to close in, the trees pressing tighter around us. I dared a look over my shoulder and froze. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure, a silhouette hidden among the trunks. It was tall, with long arms that moved unnaturally, like a puppet on strings. My friend must have seen the terror on my face, because she grabbed my arm and pulled me forward. "Run," she shouted. We ran, branches whipping our faces, feet stumbling over roots. The thumping grew louder, echoing in the clearing behind us. We didn't stop, not even when the path ahead split into two. We took the left, the wrong choice, but I didn't care. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath, white and misty in front of me. I heard a sound I'll never forget, a loud, guttural growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the forest. We burst out of the tree line, gasping for breath, and turned back to see the clearing behind us. There was nothing there, no figure, no noise. Only the stillness of the woods, as if nothing had happened. We didn't speak on the way home. Neither of us dared mention the sound, or the shape that had flickered in the corner of our vision. But when I checked my phone, I found a picture I didn't take, a dark figure with a face that wasn't human, standing at the edge of the clearing, and I knew we had never truly left the forest. It started out as an ordinary evening. I was taking a drive with my cousin along the back roads that wound through the farmland, just past the last edge of town. We had spent the day in the city, going to a farmer's market and picking up some homemade snacks. The sun was setting, painting the fields in rich shades of orange and purple. It was late enough that the farmhouses and silos blended into the landscape, their outlines softened by the dusk. We took a turn onto a dirt road that led to a small lake, one my cousin, Jack, had discovered when he was a kid. The road was overgrown with tall, swaying grass, and the trees that flanked it were so thick they seemed to close in around us. I never liked that road, not because it was creepy, but because it had an eerie way of making you feel like you were being watched. I figured it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but I never said anything to Jack. We parked the car by the lake's edge and grabbed our things. The air was warm and thick, and as we walked to the water, the sounds of the nearby farm animals were replaced by the buzz of cicadas and the occasional hoot of an owl. We settled in on an old, rotting bench that was too far gone to be comfortable, but just right for nostalgia. As the night settled in, we swapped stories, laughed at old memories, and watched the water ripple in the moonlight. I leaned back, taking a deep breath of the crisp air. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move near the tree line. I blinked, dismissing it as an animal or my imagination. But then it happened again, a shadow flitting between the dark trunks, too fast to be a deer. "Jack, did you see that?" I whispered. Jack looked up, squinting into the darkness. "What?" I didn't answer. I was already walking toward the tree line, my heart hammering in my chest. The moonlight barely reached that far, and the shadows seemed to pulse as if something unseen was breathing in the dark. Then, a sound, a rustling. It was coming from just behind the first row of trees, right where I was standing. My pulse quickened, my breath caught. "Hey, let's head back," Jack called, his voice tense. "It's getting late." I nodded, hesitating to turn around. I took one last glance at the dark outline of the woods before stepping away. Just as I turned back to the lake, I heard a thud and a quick, skittering noise, like something large moving fast through the underbrush. Then, silence. "Let's go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. As we made our way back to the car, the air seemed colder, the forest darker. The buzzing of the cicadas had stopped, and an unnatural quiet settled over us. When we reached the car, I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized something. The sounds of the forest had been replaced with a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from behind the trees. I pulled open the car door, fumbling with the keys. Jack was already inside, his hands clenched on the steering wheel. I threw myself in, and just as I slammed the door shut, a shadow flitted past the car, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. "Drive, Jack," I yelled, voice tight. The car roared to life, tires spinning on the gravel as we tore down the path. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel the eyes on us, the pressure of something following in the dark. It wasn't until we reached the main road, and the town lights came into view, that the weight on my chest began to lift. When we finally stopped, breathing ragged and shaking, Jack turned to me. "Did you see it?" he whispered. I nodded, voice barely a croak. "I don't know what it was, but it wasn't anything from the woods." Jack's eyes widened, but before he could say anything, I felt the sensation that we were still being watched. The dark, hunched shape of the woods behind us seemed to shift, and then the glint of something pale, stared out from between the trees, and that was when I knew we weren't alone. It was just another weekend trip. One of those spontaneous plans made when life started to feel suffocating. My friends and I decided to head out to a small, abandoned amusement park that had been closed for decades. It was the kind of place that was spoken about in hushed tones. A rumor passed around at bars and campfires, but none of us truly believed it was haunted. We were there for the thrill of the unknown, to see if we could convince ourselves the old legends were true. We arrived just before sunset, the fading orange light casting long, twisted shadows over resting rides and crumbling ticket booths. The entrance, a once vibrant arch with peeling paint, seemed to grin at us, daring us to step inside. With flashlights and a mixture of nervous excitement, we ventured in. The park was a maze of broken attractions, half-missing clown faces on the Ferris wheel, an old carousel where the horses were now chipped and mottled with dirt. Everything was still, the air heavy with dust and the scent of decaying metal. The silence was so complete it felt like we were intruding on something sacred, something that shouldn't be disturbed. We explored for hours, jumping at every creak and groan as the wind swept through the twisted metal. By the time the last light dipped below the horizon, we were ready to head back. But as we walked toward the entrance, a loud, shrill laughter echoed from the direction of the FUNHOUSE. We all froze. The laughter was high-pitched and childlike, like it was coming from deep within the warped hallways of the broken building. My friend Mark snorted, trying to laugh it off. "Probably just the wind," he said, though there was a tremor in his voice. "Let's check it out," Lizzie whispered, her eyes wide in the beam of her flashlight. None of us said no. Our curiosity got the better of us. The fun house was even worse up close. Its walls were warped, the windows shattered with jagged edges that looked like broken teeth. We pushed open the door, its rusty hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The air was colder than outside, the scent of dampness and mold clinging to our noses. The floorboards creaked beneath our weight, and the walls seemed to lean in, closing us off from the rest of the world. We moved through the maze, the laughter growing louder, echoing from somewhere deeper within. We finally reached the center, where an old mirror maze stretched out in front of us, cracked and splintered like spider webs. In the dim light, we could see each other's reflections in a million broken pieces. The laughter stopped suddenly, and we all tensed, looking around. "Who's there?" Mark called out, his voice barely louder than a whisper. A shadow moved in one of the mirrors. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, it was gone. But now, I noticed that one of the mirrors wasn't cracked, it was smooth, polished like a new surface. As I stepped closer, the cold feeling of dread spread through my chest. The mirror reflected my own face. But behind me, in the reflection, a dark figure stood just out of sight. My pulse quickened, my mouth going dry. The figure stepped forward, slowly, impossibly, and I stumbled back. Lizzie screamed, and Mark yelled, "Run!" But the entrance we had come through was gone. The walls of the fun house seemed to have shifted, trapping us inside. The figure in the mirror moved, its shadowy limbs stretching out like they were reaching for me. I could feel its gaze, heavy and suffocating, seeping into my bones. The mirror cracked, then shattered, and the laughter returned, louder, closer, as if dozens of people were in the maze with us. We bolted, not looking back, running through the maze of cracked glass and warped hallways until we stumbled outside. The night air was sharp with the scent of rust and cold, and the laughter still echoed in our ears. We didn't stop running until we were out of the park, looking back to see the lights of the fun house flickering and going out, one by one. None of us spoke on the ride home. We didn't need to. We all knew that whatever we had seen was waiting for us in that mirror, something that wasn't just part of the broken fun house, but something that had been trapped, lurking for years, waiting for someone to set it free. The evening was beautiful, clear skies stretching over the vineyard like a dark velvet blanket. My friends and I had decided to spend the day at the family estate, my uncle's vineyard. It was a special occasion. The first harvest of the season was about to start, and we were all excited to celebrate. The sun had dipped behind the hills, painting the sky with deep hues of purple and gold as we wandered through the rows of grapevines. We'd finished dinner around a fire pit, swapping stories and toasting with glasses of homemade wine. Laughter echoed through the valley, blending with the sounds of crickets and distant owls. The scent of fermenting grapes lingered in the air, sweet and earthy. It was the kind of night you'd remember forever, peaceful, warm, safe. That's why I didn't understand why my skin prickled when we decided to take a walk along the edge of the vineyard. The night was so still, so perfect, but there was something in the air, an electric tension that didn't match the calm of the evening. The path led us to an old, abandoned shed at the far end of the property. It was the kind of structure that had long been forgotten, half hidden by ivy and thick underbrush. As kids, we had always dared each other to go near it, but we never did. Now, as adults, we found ourselves drawn to it, half-jokingly daring each other to go inside. I felt the pull of nostalgia and the thrill of the unknown. "Let's see what's inside," I said, the bravado in my voice masking the unease that had settled in my stomach. The others agreed, and we pushed open the wooden door. It creaked on its hinges, revealing a dark interior full of dust and cobwebs. The moonlight that filtered through the broken slats of the wall cast thin, shifting lines across the floor. I reached for my phone to light the way, its beam cutting through the darkness. "Is it just me? Or does it feel colder in here?" my friend Emily asked, shivering. "It's just the draft," I said, but my voice was hollow, even to my own ears. I took a step forward, my foot crunching on something sharp. I bent down and picked up a cracked wine bottle, its glass dull with age. It had an odd, musty smell, like something had spilled and been left to rot. Suddenly, a noise pierced the silence. It came from the back of the shed, a faint, scraping sound, like nails on wood. We all froze, eyes locked with each other. The sound came again, louder this time. It was unmistakably human, though twisted and uneven. "Hello," I called out, trying to mask the tremor in my voice. No response. The air grew colder still, and my breath came out in ragged puffs. Something moved in the dark, a shadow that didn't belong to any of us. I swung my flashlight in that direction, and for a moment, I saw it, a pale, thin figure with eyes that glowed a dull, unnatural green. It stood, unmoving, just beyond the beam's reach. The others screamed, and we stumbled backward toward the door. My heart thundered in my chest as I fumbled with the lock, finally shoving the door open. We ran out into the night, not daring to look back. We didn't stop until we were back by the fire, gasping and shaking. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves and rattling the branches. But, as we caught our breath, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The pale figure was standing at the edge of the vineyard, just beyond the moon's light, watching us. The next day, we didn't go back to the shed. We didn't even mention it, but every time I passed that part of the property, I swore I could feel eyes on me, cold and hungry. I never told anyone what I saw, but I can still hear the scraping sound, like nails on wood, echoing in the back of my mind. I think it's still there, waiting. The evening had been perfect, a last-minute road trip with friends, chasing the sunset along an old, winding highway that cut through rolling fields and endless orchards. We pulled off the road just as night began to fall, seeking the perfect place to stargaze. The clearing we found was surrounded by towering oaks and the scent of wildflowers, and we stretched out on blankets with our heads tilted up, drinking in the crisp air and the glittering night sky. That's when we heard the faint sound of music. It was soft at first, barely louder than the rustle of the wind. But, as we lay there, eyes wide with curiosity, it grew clearer. It was an old song, one with an ancient, mournful melody, like something out of an old folk tale. My friends exchanged puzzled glances, half-heartedly laughing it off as the wind-carrying sound from a distant festival or event. But when we stood up and looked around, there was nothing. Just trees, dark and still. I felt a chill slide down my back. Something about the way the music sounded so close but impossible to trace made my skin prickle. I turned to Sam, who was always the most skeptical of us, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than our imaginations. "Do you hear that?" I asked, voice barely above a whisper. Sam squinted into the dark. "Yeah, but it's probably just some old radio or something. Let's not make a big deal out of it." But when we looked down the dirt path leading to the clearing, we noticed the shadows seemed to shift. The song grew louder, moving from the murmur of a lullaby to a deep, harmonious hum that sent a wave of discomfort through me. The crickets had stopped chirping, the wind had stilled, and the world felt locked in place, holding its breath. I glanced at the others, who were now starting to look uneasy. Just as we were about to pack up and head back to the car, the song stopped. In the eerie silence that followed, a different sound reached our ears, a low, metallic scraping, like nails on a sheet of metal. I froze. It wasn't just the noise, it was the feeling. Something in the air had shifted, as though we were no longer alone. "Let's go," Sam said, voice trembling. We grabbed our things, half running back the way we came, the hairs on my arms standing on end. We reached the car, our laughter strained and nervous as we tried to convince each other that nothing was wrong. We pulled out, the headlights cutting a path through the darkness. But, as we passed the edge of the clearing, I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught my breath. A figure stood at the edge of the path, half shrouded in shadows. Its silhouette was humanoid but distorted, as if it had been carved out of the night itself. Its head tilted in our direction, and for a moment, I thought I saw its mouth curve into something that almost resembled a smile. My heart pounded in my chest, and I slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The figure disappeared from sight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, following. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the trees whispering secrets as we sped past them, the sense of being pursued growing stronger. When we finally reached town, the streetlights felt like a promise of safety. We stopped at a diner and tried to calm down, sipping on cheap coffee that did nothing to chase away the fear. It was only when we looked out the window at the dark stretch of road behind us that we saw it again, just for a second. The figure, standing at the edge of the woods, watching. The waitress at the counter glanced at us, her eyes shadowed with a knowing look. "You're not the first to see him," she said softly. "They say he comes when the music plays. We left before dawn, but I knew I would never forget the look in that creature's eyes. It was as though it had been waiting for us, and now, I was certain that it would always be there, just out of sight, waiting for the next song to begin." The night started out like any other. I was out with my sister on a late-night walk along the riverbank, the kind that's more about talking and unwinding than anything else. It was fall, and the leaves were like fire on the trees, glowing under the dim moonlight. We had been talking about everything and nothing, our laughter echoing against the water. We walked a good distance from the street lights, far enough to be swallowed by the gentle darkness. The city was just a smudge in the distance, a heartbeat I could barely hear. The river murmured alongside us, its surface shimmering with the moon's pale gaze. I was just about to ask her what she wanted for her birthday when I heard it. A sound. It was faint, but distinct, a splashing noise. I paused, my gaze darting to the water. "Did you hear that?" I asked. She looked at me with wide eyes, then shook her head. I could feel the cool night air pressing against my skin, making me shiver. It was almost like the river was alive, a giant creature whispering something I couldn't understand. I didn't want to look away, but I did, turning my head back to her and forcing a smile. "Probably just a fish," I said, but my voice was more unsure than I'd intended. Then we heard it again, this time louder and closer. It was a splashing, but not just one. It was a series of splashes, rhythmic, deliberate. I spun around, heart racing. The surface of the water rippled, churning as if something unseen was moving underneath. Before I could speak, a figure shot out of the water, draped in wet, tangled hair and clothes that clung to its skeletal frame. Its eyes were empty, black as the deepest night. It reached out, clawed fingers outstretched, and its mouth fell open in a silent scream. I grabbed my sister's arm, pulling her backward as the creature lunged. It hit the bank with a sickening thud and clawed itself toward us, dragging its body with an unnatural, jerky motion. We stumbled and ran, gasping for breath as we tore through the trees, their branches snagging at our clothes. My sister tripped and fell, and I turned around, my chest already burning from the effort. It was right there, only a few feet away. Its wet eyes locked onto mine, and I couldn't move, couldn't scream. But then, just as suddenly as it had emerged, it froze, its head tilting as if listening to something I couldn't hear. A whistle. Low and guttural, like something shifting in the dark. It was coming from the woods. The creature's mouth shut, and for a second, I thought it was about to retreat. Then it turned its head to the source of the sound, its movements quick and sharp. The dark woods behind us seemed to shiver as something else emerged. Another figure, its shape indistinguishable but bigger, moving with a rhythm that didn't belong to anything human. My sister pulled on my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to go now," she shouted, and I stumbled, barely catching myself before we ran, the sound of wet footsteps pounding after us. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the nearest street light, our breath ragged, our legs shaking. The creature didn't follow. It stayed there, at the edge of the woods, staring, the inky darkness of its eyes glistening under the moon. I glanced back once more before we sprinted home, every step feeling like it could be our last. The next morning, I went back to the river, heart heavy and fists clenched. I found the spot where we'd seen it, hoping to make sense of what happened. The water was still, the surface unmod. There was no sign of anything abnormal, just the calm flow of the river, the rustle of leaves, and the whispering wind. But on the ground, near the edge, was a single, tiny footprint, wet and shaped like a child's, and the sound of a whistle, sharp and low, came from the woods behind me. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, but here I am, sharing a story that still keeps me up at night. A few years ago, my friends and I rented a cabin for a weekend getaway. It wasn't an extravagant place, but it was tucked away in a secluded part of the forest, far from civilization. Perfect for a group of friends looking to disconnect. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the air crisp with the scent of pine. We settled in, made ourselves comfortable, and as evening fell, we gathered around the fireplace. It felt perfect, but things began to feel off. At first, I thought it was the isolation or maybe the silence that surrounded the cabin, but it was more than that. It felt like we were being watched. Around midnight, we decided to go to bed. The house grew quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wood settling. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to push away the sense of unease that gnawed at me. It wasn't long before I heard something faint, at first, like soft tapping at my window. I convinced myself it was just the wind, the trees brushing against the house. But then it came again, louder. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, like someone or something was knocking at my window. I lay there, paralyzed, heart pounding in my chest. The knocks grew faster, then stopped. I didn't dare look out the window. Instead, I turned on my side, trying to ignore it, willing myself to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. I heard the sounds again, but this time they weren't from the window. It was at the door, slow, deliberate knocks, as if someone was waiting for me to answer. I sat up in bed, frozen, and listened. Then came the voice. "Let me in." It was faint, like a whisper carried by the wind. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure if it was real, but it felt like it was coming from right outside my door. My heart raced. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The voice came again, this time more insistent. "Let me in." I finally worked up the courage to peek through the crack in the door, but there was nothing. No one. Just the dark, empty hallway. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The next morning, I didn't mention anything to the others. They were all still sound asleep when I woke up, so I kept my nerves to myself. But as we sat around the breakfast table, one of my friends, Laura, spoke up. "I heard something weird last night," she said, her voice shaky. Like, knocking at my window. It was ... like someone was outside. I thought I was just imagining it, but now I'm not sure. The others exchanged uneasy looks, but no one said much. I couldn't believe it. I wasn't the only one. Later that day, we decided to take a walk in the woods to clear our heads. We spent hours hiking, but the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was the way the trees seemed to close in around us, the unnatural silence that seemed to follow us wherever we went. It wasn't normal. That evening, we sat around the fire again, trying to enjoy the night. But the strange feeling lingered, like an invisible presence watching us. When we went to bed, I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't quiet. I kept hearing things outside, the same tapping, the same whispering. It was like it was trying to get in. But what terrified me the most was when I heard someone whisper my name. It was clear as day. I jumped out of bed, heart hammering, and rushed to the window. There was nothing there. The woods were silent, unnervingly so. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to alarm anyone. I couldn't explain it. I had to stay calm. The next morning, we packed up early. None of us spoke much, but there was an unspoken understanding. We were all on edge, and none of us wanted to stay another night. As we walked to the car, I glanced back at the cabin. That's when I saw at the front door. It was wide open. We had all locked it the night before. I didn't wait to investigate. We piled into the car and drove off in a hurry. But, as we left the woods behind, I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror, just for a second. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching us. I don't know who or what it was, but I'll never forget the feeling. It was like we were being followed, watched by something that wasn't quite human. After that weekend, I tried to forget it. I told myself it was all in my head, just a trick of the mind. But when I looked at the photos we took during the trip, I saw something odd. In the background of one of the pictures, standing at the cabin's doorway, was a shadowy figure, just out of focus, and it wasn't any of us. To this day, I don't know what we encountered, but I know one thing for sure: whatever it wasn't human. We had been planning the weekend getaway for weeks, a group of 6 friends eager to escape city life. The cabin was located in a secluded forest, far from any distractions. When we arrived, the air was fresh, crisp, and smelled faintly of pine. We quickly settled in, enjoying the isolation and the silence of the surrounding woods. That first night, we stayed up late by the fire, drinking and chatting. It was peaceful, and none of us noticed anything strange. But around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. It wasn't a loud sound that disturbed me, just a low, almost imperceptible scraping noise. It was coming from outside my bedroom window. At first, I thought it might be a branch rubbing against the glass, but as I listened, it didn't sound like wind or nature. It sounded deliberate, like something or someone was dragging something heavy across the ground. I sat up in bed, heart racing, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I turned on the lamp and got out of bed, the floorboards creaking under my feet. I stood by the window for a few moments, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing, just the dim outline of trees swaying in the wind. The noise had stopped. Relieved, I climbed back into bed, trying to calm my nerves, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept drifting back to the strange scraping sound. It wasn't until I heard a knock soft at first that I sat bolt upright. Frozen, I crept to the door and opened it, scanning the hallway. Empty, quiet, everyone was still asleep. The knocking came again, louder this time, and it wasn't from the door, it was from downstairs, near the front door. A sudden chill swept over me. I couldn't explain why, but the atmosphere felt different, heavy, as though something was watching me. I debated waking everyone up, but I was terrified of what I might find if I did. So, I did nothing, just stood there in the hallway, listening. The knocking persisted, and the sound of dragging seemed to follow. I could hear it moving across the floorboards beneath me, slowly, with purpose. I don't know how much time passed before I finally gathered the courage to tiptoe downstairs. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the moon through the windows. My breath quickened as I approached the living room. When I turned the corner, I froze. The front door was wide open. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at the empty doorway, unable to move. The cold air rushed in from outside, making the hairs on my neck stand up. It was too dark to see what was out there, but I felt something was out there. I rushed back up the stairs, woke everyone up, and told them what had happened. They all thought I was overreacting. They were convinced I had just imagined it, maybe the wind or some animal. We checked the door and locked it again, but the strange feeling never left. Everyone went back to bed, though I couldn't sleep a wink. I kept hearing that scraping sound, the knocking, faint but persistent. In the morning, everything felt off. The air was still thick with unease, and no one could shake the feeling that something was wrong. As we packed up to leave, I noticed something hadn't before. There were muddy footprints leading up to the open door, but they didn't stop there. They continued, spreading throughout the entire cabin, but they weren't human. They were too big. I wanted to say something, but I didn't. Everyone was eager to leave, and I didn't want to freak anyone out. We left the cabin without a second glance, but the unease stayed with me. It wasn't until I got home that I noticed the worst part. When I looked in the mirror, I saw something on my neck, small, dark marks, almost like scratches, forming a circle. It looked as though something had been trying to grab me, but I hadn't felt it. I never told anyone about that. But now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that cabin never really left. Every night, I hear the scraping sound again, just outside my window. And sometimes, when I wake up, I think I see the shadow of something standing in the doorway, waiting for me to open it, waiting for me to let it in. It started as a normal evening. I was visiting an old friend who had recently moved into a big, creaky house on the edge of a dense forest. The place had a charm to it, but it also felt far too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your chest. My friend had invited a few of us over to help unpack, and by the time the sun sank, we were gathered in the living room surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, laughing and joking over pizza and drinks. The house had its quirks. The floorboards groaned with every step, and the plumbing let out strange, hollow knocks. We brushed it off at first. It was an old house after all, and old houses have personality. That's what my friend kept saying. As the night went on, we decided to explore the house more thoroughly. None of us had seen the attic yet, and in a house this old, the attic felt like a guaranteed treasure trove of weird history. The door to the attic was in the upstairs hallway, hidden behind an old pull-down ladder. The ladder creaked under our weight as we climbed up one by one. The air changed as soon as we stepped into the attic. It was colder, and the smell was heavier, like old wood and mildew. The attic was full of dusty boxes, cobweb-covered furniture, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. It looked like no one had touched the place in decades. We were rummaging through the boxes when we found something odd. It was an old photo album, but the photos inside weren't ordinary. They were black and white and showed a family, but their faces were strangely blurred. It wasn't from age or damage. It looked deliberate, as though someone had smeared their faces out before the pictures were taken. There were captions written in neat handwriting beneath each photo, but the ink had bled and run, making the words unreadable. That was when we heard it. A low, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere beneath us. At first, we thought it might be pipes again, but the sound was too deliberate. It was slow, steady, like someone knocking lightly on a wooden door. We stopped and stared at each other, unsure of what to do. My friend shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the house settling, but the rest of us weren't convinced. The tapping stopped, but something else caught my attention. In the far corner of the attic, there was a mirror leaning against the wall, its surface grimy and cracked. I don't know why I felt drawn to it, but I stepped closer. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The reflection didn't match what I was seeing. Behind me, I could see my friends standing in the attic, but in the mirror, they weren't moving. They stood frozen, their faces blank and staring directly at me. My stomach dropped, I turned around, and my friends were exactly as they should have been, laughing nervously and trying to decide whether to leave. I looked back at the mirror, and now the reflection was normal. I told myself my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We decided to head back downstairs. As we climbed down the ladder, I was the last one to leave the attic. Just as I reached the bottom, I felt a cold hand brush against my ankle. I jumped, nearly falling, and turned to look. There was nothing there. My friends laughed nervously at my reaction, but I could see in their eyes that they were spooked to dot back in the living room. We tried to distract ourselves with more jokes and stories, but the unease lingered. That's when the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness. My heart raced as we fumbled for our phones and flashlights. The tapping sound returned, louder this time, and it wasn't coming from the walls or the floor. It was coming from the staircase. The beam of my flashlight caught the stairs, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. There was a figure standing halfway down, its face pale and featureless, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. It didn't move, didn't react to the light. It just stood there, watching us, or at least I think it was watching. We froze, not daring to breathe. Then, without a sound, the figure turned and walked back up the stairs, disappearing into the shadows. We didn't stay to investigate. We grabbed our things and bolted out of the house, not stopping until we were outside in the safety of the night air. My friend moved out a week later after finding scratches on the attic walls and hearing whispers at night. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I don't want to. All I know is that when I look in mirrors now, I can't help but wonder if the reflection I'm seeing is really mine. I'll never forget that night. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a simple hike with a couple of friends. We were looking for a secluded spot to camp, a place where we could escape the noise of the city and enjoy some peace. It wasn't even supposed to be an overnight trip, but that night changed everything. We started out in the late afternoon, taking a trail that had been described to us as off the beaten path by some locals. It was supposed to be an easy trek, just a few hours to a nice, quiet clearing by a stream where we could set up camp and spend the evening. The air was crisp, the sky still clear, and everything felt perfect, at least for the first couple of hours. As we made our way deeper into the woods, we noticed something strange. There was no sound, no birds, no rustling of small animals, nothing. I assumed it was just the stillness of the forest, but the longer we walked, the more unnerving it became. Even the wind had died down. The silence felt oppressive. It was the kind of silence that made your skin tingle and your senses go on high alert, as though something was watching you. We set up camp around dusk. A small fire crackled in the middle of the clearing, and we sat around it, trying to shake off the growing unease. We didn't talk much, which felt odd for a group of friends who usually couldn't stop chatting. The quiet was heavy. Then we heard it, a voice. Soft and distant, but unmistakable. Help? It came from somewhere beyond the trees, just barely audible. At first, we thought it was a trick of the wind, but it was too clear, too real. We all froze. I looked around at my friends, trying to gauge their reactions. They were just as unnerved as I was. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, one of them replied. What the hell was that? We all stood up, eyes darting around the campfire, trying to make sense of it. The voice came again, this time louder. Help me. The words were desperate, frantic, almost pleading. Without thinking, we grabbed our flashlights and started moving toward the source of the sound. I don't know why we didn't stop. It didn't make sense. It was dark, we were in the middle of nowhere, and the voice sounded wrong, almost like it was coming from something not human. But we went anyway. The woods around us grew darker the deeper we went, the trees closing in. The air became thick, the chill biting at our skin. We followed the voice for what felt like an eternity, but it never seemed to get any closer. It was as if we were chasing a ghost, the sound shifting and moving, just out of reach. Then, we found it. A small clearing, barely big enough for all of us to stand in. At the center of it was a pile of rocks, and on top of the rocks was a crude carving, a symbol I didn't recognize, something old and unsettling. The voice stopped. We all stood there, staring at the rocks, unsure of what to do next. The silence felt suffocating. Then, we heard it again. This time, it wasn't from the distance. It was right behind us. "Help me." The voice was now right next to me, close enough that I could feel the cold breath against my neck. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, nothing but darkness. My friends were in the same state of panic, spinning in circles, their flashlights flickering wildly. We didn't know what to do. Every instinct told us to run, but the path back was already obscured by the shadows. That's when I noticed it, a shadow. A figure, standing just outside the circle of our lights, barely visible but unmistakable. I stepped toward it, my heart racing. The other shouted for me to stop, but I couldn't. I had to know what it was. I took another step forward, and the figure moved. It wasn't a person. It was a shape, a black silhouette. No distinct features, just an outline that seemed to shift with the light. And then, it spoke again, but this time, it wasn't a plea for help. "Leave." The voice was deep and unnatural, reverberating in my chest like a thunderclap. My friends screamed and pulled me back, dragging me away from the figure. We stumbled back through the trees, terrified and confused, not daring to look behind us. The forest seemed to open up before us, like the path had been waiting. When we made it back to the clearing where we had set up camp, the fire was out. The tents were gone, completely vanished. Everything was still, but not in the same way as before. It was a stillness that felt empty, like the forest had swallowed us whole and left nothing but the echo of our fear. I can't explain what happened. I don't know what we saw, or who or what had been calling us. But there's one thing I know for sure. The figure wasn't the thing we were supposed to fear. It wasn't the thing that wanted us to leave. It was the thing that wanted us to stay. We weren't the type to go to haunted places. It wasn't that we didn't believe in ghosts. It was just that none of us wanted to test it out. But when we saw the ad for a weekend getaway at a supposedly haunted house, we thought it would be fun. Just a harmless thrill, a way to break up the monotony. The house was old, much older than we expected. The kind of place where the floorboards creaked under every step and the air smelled faintly of mildew. We arrived late on a Friday evening, the sun already down, and the house seemed to greet us with an eerie silence. The first few hours were fine. We joked about the house's creepy reputation, settled into our rooms, and started a game of cards in the living room. But, as the night wore on, things started to feel off. Around midnight, we heard it. A thudding noise coming from the upstairs. It was faint at first, like footsteps, but the sound grew louder. There was no one else in the house, no one but us. We all paused, listening. The footsteps stopped, then started again, this time running down the hallway. I was ready to laugh it off, but something stopped me. It was too deliberate. I suggested we check it out. My friends hesitated, but curiosity got the best of them. We tiptoed up the stairs, our hearts pounding in our chests. The hallway upstairs was dark, but we could see the door to one of the rooms open a crack, just enough to feel like something was watching us. Then the thud came again, closer this time. It was coming from the open room. We didn't dare move. The noise stopped. For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there, frozen. And then, a voice, faint and raspy, came from the room. "Leave." The sound sent a chill down my spine. We all backed away, but then the door slammed shut by itself, as if something inside didn't want us near. I don't think any of us slept that night. The air was too thick with unease. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, felt like it was watching us. We could hear whispers from the other rooms, distant voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Morning came, but the strange feelings didn't go away. We tried to forget about it, to shrug it off as just a prank or our imagination running wild, but something about that place still unsettled us. After breakfast, we decided to explore the house. We went into the attic, hoping to find something to distract us. The stairs creaked under our feet as we made our way up. The attic was dusty, filled with old furniture and boxes, but there was something strange about the far corner. A large mirror, covered in dust, stood there, reflecting only the dim light from our flashlights. We wiped the dust off and stared into it. The reflection was odd fuzzy, blurry, like the mirror couldn't quite capture the room right. Then it shifted. For a brief moment, it looked like the room behind us wasn't the attic at all. It was a hallway, with the same door we'd seen earlier, the one that slammed shut. But it wasn't just that. There was something else in the reflection, standing in the hallway. A figure, a man, tall and thin, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. His face was obscured, but his posture was unnerving, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though he was staring directly at us. I gasped and turned around. There was nothing behind us, just the dusty attic. We all felt it, then a cold wave of dread. The temperature in the room dropped, and the whispers returned, now louder, more urgent. We didn't waste any time. We hurried down the stairs and out of the house, our nerves frayed, but as we were leaving, something caught my eye. It was a small piece of paper tucked under the door. I picked it up, feeling a strange sensation in my fingers as I unfolded it. The message was simple, written in jagged handwriting. "Don't look in the mirror." I nearly dropped it. My hands shook as I showed it to the others. We all stared at each other, too terrified to speak. We didn't stay another minute. We packed up and left, not daring to look back. The drive home was quiet, everyone too shaken to talk. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I froze. For a brief second, I saw the same reflection in the glass, the tall figure, standing behind me, its face still hidden. The figure was in the mirror again. But this time, it wasn't the old house, it was our car, and the figure was standing just inches from my seat. That's when I realized. It wasn't just the house that was haunted. It had followed us. We decided to go camping in the woods, a group of 4 of us, looking for an escape from the noise of the city. We'd set up our tents by a stream and spent the day hiking, laughing, and swimming. The kind of carefree joy that only comes with the silence of nature. But that night, everything changed. As the sun set, we built a campfire and roasted marshmallows. The air was still, the kind of stillness that feels unnatural. As the fire crackled, we heard something soft, almost too soft to notice, a rustling from the direction of the trees. We paused, and for a moment, everything felt off. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked, his voice low. I nodded. We all listened, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. It was then that we saw it, a figure, barely visible against the darkness of the forest. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a shadow moving in the distance, but the shape didn't move like a human. It was too fluid, too wrong. "Probably a deer," I said, trying to laugh it off. But none of us seemed convinced. We stayed by the fire for a while longer, talking to mask the unease. But the wrestling didn't stop. It circled us, getting closer each time, as if whatever was out there was getting braver. Finally, we decided to go to bed, each of us retreating to our separate tents. But sleep didn't come easy. I was lying in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of my tent, when I heard it. A whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. It came from outside, just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. "Help me!" My blood ran cold. I froze, listening for more. Nothing. Was it a voice? Or the wind? I cautiously unzipped my tent, peeking out into the dark. There was nothing. No one. I was about to zip it back up when I saw something. Not a person, but a shape, barely visible under the cover of night. It was moving slowly, crawling on all fours toward our campsite. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I wake the others? What if it was dangerous? I quickly zipped the tent shut and lay there, my breath shallow, until I heard a soft tap against the canvas. My stomach dropped. It wasn't the whine. Tap. The sound came again, followed by a low growl. I held my breath. The growling was coming from just outside my tent. I was frozen, terrified to make a sound. What was it? It didn't sound like an animal, more like a person, but distorted. I grabbed my phone, trying to turn on the flashlight, but it wouldn't work. The screen flickered, then went black. Panic set in. I had to get out of there. I slowly unzipped the tent, keeping as quiet as I could. The moonlight barely illuminated the clearing, but I could still see the dark shape just a few feet away from me. It was kneeling, its body trembling in a way that was unnatural. Its head snapped toward me. I gasped and slammed the tent flap shut, my heart racing. But then I heard something else. The voice again. But now, it wasn't just one whisper. It was multiple voices, all speaking at once. "Help us, please, they're coming." I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I had to get out. I tried to wake Jake and the others, but none of them were answering. The voices grew louder, and the ground beneath my tent began to tremble as if something huge was moving underneath. And then it hit me. Everything I had thought was a whisper, a rustle, a figure in the dark wasn't outside. It was inside. It wasn't a monster from the woods. It was us, trapped, confused. The whispers weren't coming from outside the tent. They were coming from inside the fabric. I scrambled to unzip my tent, not knowing what I would find. The others were awake now, panicking too. Looking around, their faces pale with fear. We stumbled out of our tents, our eyes darting around. We were no longer in the forest. The trees had vanished, and we stood in the middle of a dark, empty field. The sky above us was black and oppressive, the stars dim. Something snapped behind us, a loud crack of dry wood. We turned around and saw what I can only describe as a mass of dark, tangled branches, creeping toward us like fingers from the ground. Then the voices returned, clearer now, but they weren't speaking to us anymore. They were speaking through us. In my mind, in my body, we never leave. The branches reached out, brushing against our legs. It felt cold, sharp, like something dead. The ground started to shake again, and for a brief second, I thought we were back at the campsite. But I turned and saw the fire still burning, far off in the distance. Then, the voices stopped. We were alone, back in the forest. Just a couple of friends and me, out in the wilderness, hiking and camping under the stars. The trailhead seemed normal at first, an old forest road winding through thick trees, the air fresh with pine and earth. We passed a few other hikers, but soon, the trail narrowed, and we found ourselves far from anyone else. By mid-afternoon, we found a perfect spot, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. We set up camp, lit a fire, and settled in for the night. As dusk fell, the usual sounds of the forest began to fade. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence. It didn't bother us at first. We figured it was just a quiet stretch of woods. Night came quickly, and as we sat around the fire, it was like the world around us had swallowed any remaining noise. No crickets, no owls, just silence. I was starting to feel uneasy, but I tried to ignore it. Then came the first strange thing. We heard a loud crack, like something heavy snapping a branch. What was that? My friend asked, his voice tight. We all stared into the dark woods beyond the firelight, but nothing was there. Maybe it was an animal, but something about it didn't sit right. I told everyone to stay close, and we tried to keep the mood light, making jokes and telling stories, but the silence around us only deepened. The fire popped and crackled, casting long, twisted shadows on the trees. Then, I felt the sensation that someone was watching us. I glanced around nervously, but nobody else seemed to notice. My friends were busy talking, laughing, unaware. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I stepped away from the fire to get some water from our cooler, and that's when I saw it. A figure, not far into the woods, standing still as stone. A shape, too tall to be a man, its limbs unnaturally long, and its head tilted at an odd angle. It didn't move, just stared. My blood ran cold. I turned back quickly to the fire, heart pounding. My throat felt tight as I tried to act normal. But when I looked back, the figure was gone. What's wrong? One of my friends asked. Nothing, I muttered, but I couldn't shake the image. I didn't tell them what I saw. They would laugh, call me paranoid. But I knew what I saw. I was certain of it. And just as I convinced myself to forget about it, the silence broke again. A shrill, sharp cry from deeper in the woods, like a woman screaming. We all jumped, and for a moment, none of us moved. Did you hear that? Someone whispered. I nodded, trying to stay calm. It sounded too far to be anyone in trouble, but the fear in that scream made my skin crawl. We quickly packed up the fire. Our conversation dying out, we decided to turn in early. I crawled into my sleeping bag, heart still racing from the scream, but trying to force myself to sleep. As I lay in the dark, I heard something again, a soft rustling, too light to be a wild animal, too deliberate. It sounded like footsteps. Someone was moving around our campsite. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced at my friends, but they were asleep, oblivious. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped my tent. Stepping outside, the forest was pitch black. I shone the flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing, no movement, no sound. Just the overwhelming weight of silence pressing in on me. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it again, that tall figure. It was standing just at the edge of our campsite, hidden just enough to stay out of the light. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. It was like my body had shut down. The figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, until it was just on the edge of the light. And then, in a voice that seemed to echo in my mind, it spoke. "You should have gone home." I stumbled back, too scared to scream, too terrified to move. The figure stepped forward again, but then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The air grew colder, and in that moment, I realized something. There was no sound, no wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then the ground beneath us shook, a violent, bone-rattling tremor, and the figure vanished. Not into the shadows, not into the trees. It just disappeared. The shaking stopped as quickly as it had started, and the forest went eerily still. I didn't wait around to figure out what had just happened. I yelled for everyone to pack up, and we didn't stop until we were miles away from that place. We didn't speak much on the way back, but as we passed through the last stretch of woods, I saw something that made my stomach drop. That figure, standing in the trees, watching us. Only this time, it wasn't alone, there were more of them. We'd been planning this camping trip for months. A weekend getaway to disconnect, to get away from the noise and distractions of the world. Me and my 3 friends, Jake, Ellie, and Tom, had spent days picking the perfect spot in the woods, far enough from the trail to feel isolated, but not so far that we'd be completely cut off if anything went wrong. We arrived in the early evening, setting up camp near a small creek that ran through the area. The sun dipped behind the trees as we worked, casting long shadows over the clearing. The air smelled fresh, crisp, with the scent of pine and damp earth. It felt peaceful, idyllic even. That night, we sat around the campfire, eating, joking, and telling stories. It was the kind of atmosphere where you felt safe, surrounded by friends and the flickering warmth of the fire. But then things began to feel off. It started with Ellie. She was sitting closest to the tree line, her back to the forest, when she suddenly froze. At first, we thought she was just being dramatic, messing around like she always did. But then she looked at us, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I heard something," she said, her voice shaky. We all stopped talking, listening intently. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. Jake stood up, shaking his head. "Ellie, there's nothing out there. It's just the wind, or an animal. Don't freak yourself out." But Ellie wasn't convinced. She insisted she heard something movement, like footsteps, just beyond the reach of the firelight. We all stared into the darkness beyond the clearing, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sound. We laughed it off, convincing ourselves she was just letting her imagination run wild. But, as the night wore on, the unease crept back in. The shadows in the trees seemed to shift more than usual, and the air felt heavier, like something was watching us. The woods around us seemed unnaturally still, and the night seemed to stretch on much longer than it should have. At some point, we decided to head to our tents. We doused the fire, the embers glowing faintly in the night. We settled into our sleeping bags, but none of us could sleep. The sounds of the forest had taken on a strange quality, like they were distorted, just out of sync. Every rustle in the brush, every snap of a twig, felt amplified, as though the woods themselves were breathing. Around 3 a.m., we heard it. A loud bang, like something large crashing into a tree. It was so sudden, so sharp, that we all jolted upright in our tents. There was no mistaking it. Something was out there. Tom was the first to grab a flashlight. He crawled out of his tent cautiously, shining the beam toward the woods. For a moment, there was nothing, just the dark, empty trees. But then the beam caught something, a figure dot. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the darkness. A person? No, not quite. The figure was too still, too unnaturally rigid. It didn't move, just stood there, staring in our direction. We froze. None of us dared to move. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't shift its weight. It just watched. Who the hell is that? Jake hissed, barely above a whisper. We had no idea. We hadn't seen anyone else on the hike-in. No campers, no sign of anyone else around. But there it was, standing like a mannequin in the trees, its head slightly tilted, its limbs unnaturally straight. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling. I was about to call the ranger station when the figure moved. Slowly, it turned, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by strings. Get inside the tents now, I yelled, grabbing Ellie by the arm and pulling her toward her tent. We scrambled, hearts pounding, breath shallow. The flashlight had flickered out, casting the camp back into darkness. We could hear the figure moving closer, the rustling of branches, the slow scrape of something dragging across the ground. Suddenly, there was a loud thud like a body hitting the ground. Then silence. We waited for what felt like hours, too scared to move, our minds racing with worst-case scenarios. But after a long while, we heard footsteps retreating, disappearing into the woods. One by one, we mustered the courage to step outside, the fear still heavy in our chests. When we checked the area where the figure had stood, we found something strange. It wasn't human at all. It was a mannequin, but not a normal one. This one had its face carved out, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, empty skin, and on the back of its neck, there was something scrawled in faded red letters. I see you. We ran back to our cars in the morning, barely stopping to pack up. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, still watching us. And then, as we passed the last turn before the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was the mannequin. Still watching,